If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
People who camp, hike, or venture into the woods and forests late at night, what scary things have you seen or experienced out there?
Recently, while camping with my family near the Appalachian Mountains, I witnessed an unexplainable strange light. I was in my tent, and I had been going in and out of sleep for a few hours, and around 4 a.m. something woke me up completely, and I was wide awake. I looked behind me in my tent, and through the side of the tent, which wasn't see-through, I saw a light just a few feet from me. The light was bright enough to penetrate the tent without being blinding, and it hovered about 7 to 8 feet above the ground. It moved slowly around my tent in a circle and disappeared after about 10 minutes, leaving no sound behind. It was way too bright to be a lightning bug, so I really have no idea what it was. After that light went away, there was a much brighter light a lot higher off the ground. And I'm sure it wasn't the moon, because the moon was visible on the other side of the tent. I just want to know if anyone knows what these lights might have been, because they scared the shit out of me, probably because we were talking about skinwalkers and Wendigos right before we all went to sleep. In the summer of 2022, my last camping trip with my family, we went to a popular camping location in Ohio. If you can figure it out, bonus to you. My sister and I, me 17 at the time and her 14 at the time, shared a tent, so we stayed up giggling and messing around quite a bit, like playing Uno or talking about boys she liked. Mostly for week 1 in the 2-week trip, it was fine, we slept and talked like normal. Until the second week, where things took a turn. I have a really hard time with sleeping, so when week 2 strolled around, my sister would be passed out asleep, and I'd be sitting wide awake for hours at a time. While these hours where I sat awake, I heard noises, crunching, shifting, growling, and howling. The basic outdoor noises. For the next 2 days of week 2, I heard a lot of walking and talking in the woods, things like "come here" or "help me." Sometimes I'd hear faint whispering near my tent. I was honestly scared shitless. On the last 2 nights, which probably had been the worst, my sister was awake, both of us playing Uno with her phone dead and mine on a cool 20%. Around maybe 2 a.m., my sister went to lie down, and so did I until I heard thick footsteps around the tent, too heavy for deer or wolves but too light for bears or elk. It was almost like a person was walking around my tent. My sister was awake and quietly watched as someone or something pressed on the tent sides and door. Now my sister and I move all the little tent zippers into our tents at night to keep people from trying to get in. Clearly this person or thing was looking for said zippers. So we felt pretty smart. This was night 4 of week 2. Now finally week 2, night 5. The same heavy footsteps, the same touching at the walls, and the same whispering to "come here" and "come out." My scared buddy waited until 5 a.m., where I sat outside waiting for my grandma. While sitting out, I heard whispering and then screaming, the scariest, most blood-chilling scream in the world. It sounded like some kind of animal or person or something, but it was so loud I nearly peed myself. I was glad we left and even happier to not go back for 2 years. Does anyone know what this is? Or if it was some dude lurking on our campsite? This story is from my hike from Graz, Austria, to Venice, Italy. It might not be as frightening as some other stories here, but I wanted to share it. In the summer of 2023, my 2 friends and I, all 17 years old at the time, were in the final week of our hike from Graz to Venice. It was late at night, and we still hadn't found a place to set up our tents. We were walking along a seemingly endless beach, exhaustion weighing heavily on us after 20 days of walking. Our legs ached from blisters, and we had already taken a few minutes long pauses to regain energy. We were all eager to rest. Eventually, we found a suitable spot on the map, a beach further away from the city we were in, and decided to head there. By this time, we had briefly entered the city but hadn't gone deep into it. The streets were empty except for some tourists near the beach. I was so exhausted that I was even walking with my eyes closed. To reach our campsite, we had to take a small gravel path connected to one of the streets. As we arrived at the intersection that led to our intended campsite, a man suddenly emerged from the path we needed to take, which led right into the woods, and walked right discovery. The man was now following us, heading back from where he had just come. As we began to worry, all our exhaustion and pain vanished, along with the weight of our fully packed backpacks. While still walking down this dark path, we started discussing what to do rather loudly, not expecting him to understand our language since we weren't locals. After a brief discussion, we decided that jumping into the field next to the path was a better option than staying on it or facing the man. So, after about 30 meters of walking along the path, we jumped into the field. The field was full of crops and difficult to wade through, including jumping over some kind of ditch in the middle of the field. But with adrenaline pumping, We barely noticed the discomfort and kept running as fast as we could with 20 kilograms backpacks. As soon as the man saw us move, he immediately turned back and returned to the road we had just left. We quickly did the same, and with a head start, we managed to put some distance between us and him. Our shorts and shoes were wet, however, there was no time to care, the man was still following us. We rushed through the streets of the city, and as soon as we didn't see him anymore, we calmed down a bit. Still, fear kept us moving, trying to stay in the darkness so he couldn't see us. Walking past a gas station at the end of the city, which could be seen from the street where we had met the man, we continued and walked another 5 kilometers before finally setting up our tents, far away from where we had encountered the man. To this day, we have no idea if he was just a drunkard playing a twisted joke or if he had much more sinister intentions. And who knows what might have happened if it hadn't been for those pauses we took. We might have been right on time to meet this mysterious man further down into the darkness of the woods. Now to start this off, I'm a 29-year-old man, and 3 times a year I head up to the Georgia mountains to camp, fish, and have a great time. But after the last trip, I doubt I will ever go again. I had been super excited the week before I was to head up to Georgia, and when the day finally came, I could have died with happiness. I loaded up my dog Buddy and all my gear and started the trip. About an hour into my trip, I saw a road that I've never been on before. I decided I would take an hour to look around and go back to the main road. I lost track of time, and before I knew it, the sun was setting. I grabbed my gear and Buddy, and we hiked about 10 minutes before finding a nice clearing in the forest. I set up camp and looked around my camp. I saw a small, man-made trail leading into the dark trees and decided that Buddy and I needed a walk. I grabbed my walking stick, Buddy's leash, and a headlamp, and we headed onto the trail. I knew something was wrong when I couldn't hear a single insect or animal. My buddy and I stopped at a little creek when I saw something terrifying. 2 eyes reflecting from my headlamp. This thing was really tall, like 6 or 7 feet, and the eyes were too big to be human. My dog is usually very protective of me, but instead of barking or doing something, he whimpered and peed on my leg. I've never seen him act like this before. He's seen bears before and has scared mountain lions away before, but he never peed like this. As Buddy kept whimpering, I felt terrible. Like this thing hated me, and it could rip me to shreds if it wanted to. Then it made the scariest noise I've ever heard. It sounded like a maniac screaming. I and Buddy bolted back to our camp. In our camp I could still hear the thing. Needless to say, I was. It's staying here. I packed up the camp as Buddy stood watch. We ran to my truck and got out of there. I went straight home and didn't sleep that whole night. Later on, I looked on the internet for what could have made that noise, and nothing came close to it. I really don't know what that was, but there's something weird in the woods of Georgia. Late night hiking trip. Let's start this off with a little background, I suppose. Near my house, there's a massive 2,000+ acre area that once was home to a military production plant for TNT. It's now home to a car manufacturing plant and a nature reserve. Most of this 2,000 acre area is dense forest, and winding through the forest, there are several dirt trails. There's also an old, overgrown cemetery hidden in the forest. Some of its graves hold babies, and a few are unmarked. Possibly the graves of slaves, which wouldn't surprise me as I live in the southern USA, and the cemetery could easily be over 200 years old. Well, it was maybe a month after graduating from high school, and 3 of my friends were spending the night at my place. We decided it would be a good idea to take a midnight hike into the forest on these trails, and I had hiked on these trails before during the daytime. We didn't know what was apparently waiting for us. It was around 9 p.m., I suppose, and we started getting ready for our hiking adventure. I took my backpack from high school and gladly emptied out my remaining notes and paperbacks and filled it with snacks, quite a few water bottles, a machete, you never know when you'll need one in the woods, and a few flashlights. In addition to the flashlights, I was carrying a massive spotlight that I had bought specifically for exploring in the woods at night. It was just my friends James, Dustin, Richard, and myself. We were all geared up, and so we set out on our adventure. To get to the trails, you have to walk through maybe a mile of neighborhood roads. We were all 18 at the time, so legal curfew was no concern to us. However, having a machete in my backpack made me understandably nervous about possibly getting caught. We finally reached the trails after a 20-minute walk through the neighborhoods, all the while we were chatting about girls, games, and typical stuff. It only took about 15 or 20 minutes on the trails for us to run into whatever was waiting there. Our destination was originally the cemetery, which is maybe an hour's hike into the woods, so we didn't get far at all. We were casually hiking when we came to a hill. My friend Richard stops and says he needs to rest, saying he feels like his energy was drained. He's not a very physically fit guy, so we understood. I handed him a snack and a water bottle, and we just relaxed at the bottom of the large hill for 5 minutes. Suddenly my friend Dustin says he saw something at the top of the hill, almost like somebody hiding in the bushes that are up there. He and James decided to go check it out, taking the spotlight and the machete with them. I volunteered to stay behind with Richard. After 5 minutes of them investigating, they came tearing down the hill screaming about something. I nervously asked them what the hell was going on, and they replied, there was something in the bushes, but when we got up there, it had already moved away. The way they described it was a pitch black shadow with a single, golden eye that remained in the shadows or bushes, never coming out. They also said that if they tried to get near it, it would almost teleport into a further away shadow or bush. The look on their faces told me that it was no joke, so we got the hell out of there and rushed our way toward the neighborhood, all the while this thing is following us. However, the way it would follow us and move away if we got closer was almost as if it was asking us to follow it. Maybe it needed help, who knows? We were too scared to find out what it wanted. We finally made it back to the neighborhood and were nearly running home. The thing is still following us. Out of nowhere, I'm hit with emotions that I could only describe as an extreme sorrow and felt tears forming in my eyes. I blinked them away and notified my friends of the feelings that overcame me. We were about halfway home when James and Dustin said, "There's 2 of them. We just saw one in front of us." This scared me even more, so we began walking faster and faster. We were just about to pass the deck of one of the houses when James stopped in his tracks, a terrified mask where his face used to be. He says, "Something black just flashed in front of my face for a second or two and completely blocked everything out." We continued, going faster and faster. The 2 entities seemed to stop following us as we were about 3/4 there. What followed us then was a massive, black, ominous mist of some sort that seemed to always be behind us, blocking any light behind it. We stopped, held hands, and said a quick prayer. The black mist seemed to weaken a little, eventually disappearing as we passed a church that's right up the road from my house. The 2 black figures scared me, but I didn't feel threatened by them. The black mist, however, made me feel as if I were its prey. A few months later, it was just Dustin and me. We decided to go hiking during the day, of course. Everything was completely normal for the majority of the time. When we took a rest break about halfway to the cemetery, Dustin put his hat down on the ground, top up. We continued on, but he forgot about his hat. We were finally returning from the cemetery when I realized he had forgotten his hat and that it wasn't where he left it. We just continued on because he said he could get another. Halfway between where we rested this time and where Dustin and James originally saw the black figure, we found his hat. In the middle of the trail, upside down. The hat wasn't crumpled like someone had dropped it, it was almost as if someone picked it up, turned it upside down, and gently placed it on the ground. This happened at Camp Choyaya, a Christian summer camp in Livingston, Texas. I am not now, nor was I ever, a practicing Christian. I was 8 years old, struggling with my faith and scared shitless of demons. I had seen a news story just before summer camp about exorcisms and demonic possession, so it was fresh in my mind. I asked my camp counselor about it, and he told me that possessions only happen to people who haven't accepted Jesus into their hearts. He assumed I had already accepted Jesus, but I hadn't. In fact, I was just starting to lean away from him and the church. I don't think he was trying to scare me into believing or using fear to teach me about Jesus. I think he genuinely believed he was saying the right thing, but it only convinced me that my body was primed and ready for possession. I didn't mention demons to any of the other boys or to anyone else at camp. I would lie awake at night, staring up at the high ceiling of the cabin. My imagination would form sinister faces out of the knots and grain of the wood. There was a good portion of those 2 weeks where I didn't sleep. We played capture the flag one night. Had my counselor not rattled my world, I would have been excited. The playing field was a big hill surrounded on all sides by forest. It was a co-ed camp, and the counselors weren't allowed to play. We were even given glow sticks. It was 1991, and glow sticks weren't as common as they are today. We were divided into teams and paired up with someone older or younger. My partner was an older girl that nobody liked. She was very blunt. She wanted to hold both glow sticks because she was older and faster than me. She bolted away from the crowd to sneak up on the flag commando style. I told her to slow down. She told me to fast up and then lost me in the woods, probably on purpose. Livingston is northeast of Houston and surrounded by pine forests. Choyaya is a Coshada phrase that means a place of tall pines. If you've ever been in a dense pine forest at night, you know how creepy they can be. The trunks are like smooth, dark columns because the lowest branches are usually out of reach. The towering foliage blocks out any moonlight. The ground is soft with dead pine needles, so it's relatively quiet, even when 100 or so kids are running through the woods trying not to be hurt. So I was alone, scared of being possessed, and I didn't even have a glow stick for light. I ran through the forest, but somehow kept getting further away from the green lights and sounds of the other kids until I could no longer see or hear them. I came to a wide clearing where the power lines cut through the trees. To my left and right was a bare valley of grass with humming wires overhead, but now I could see a bit better from the light of the moon. I don't recall if it was a full moon, but it was bright enough. I crouched down in the grass, in the shadows at the edge of the woods, watching and listening intently. I no longer cared about winning the game, I just wanted to get back with the other kids and feel safe. Something happened at this point that I can't explain. It still makes my hair stand up and makes my eyes water 20 years later. I heard pounding footsteps coming toward me from the shadows to my left, slower and more lumbering than a horse, but just as loud and heavy. Too loud and heavy to be human, and exhaling a bullish snort as its feet hit the grass. I buried my head into my knees as it passed behind me, too scared to look at it directly. But I looked just after it had passed. The moon was high, so the shadows were distorted to look short and squat, not long and lean like when light comes from the horizon. What I saw was the shadow of a broad human torso, with an elongated and bent head. It was already about 30 yards away from me, and, quicker than it came, it disappeared into the woods where the game was being played. Behind me, in the grass of the clearing, was one large foot-like impression, as though it had run around me and stepped out into the moonlight only for a second. I tore off through the clearing, not sure if I was going the right way but following the power lines and staying as far from the shadows as I could. Luckily I made it back to camp and went straight to the nurse's station. Some other kids were there with cuts from the game, and I just pretended that I had gotten lost and needed water. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. If anyone else saw it, they never said anything about it to me. I didn't do so well the rest of camp, and I think this is where me and Jesus first parted ways. The rifle range and canoeing were still fun, but I was always afraid of what might come bounding out of those woods. My friends are really into camping out and everything about outdoor stuff, etc. I like it too, but not as much as they do. Once we were camping in a forest about 10 miles away from the nearest town/village. It was only me, Oliver, Jacob, and Nathan. I've noticed some weird shit that was happening, but neither of them believed me and just told me I'm being paranoid. I was like, they're probably right. The sun was coming down, and we decided to roll a massive joint. While we were smoking it, I saw someone in the forest. I was freaking out and told them what I just saw. Nathan decided it would be a great idea to go out there and look around. He took his flashlight with him and went. After like 5 minutes he came back and said he saw nothing. I didn't sleep this night. The worst thing was that we didn't sleep in a tent but in our hammocks. The next day was the worst thing. When the sun was coming up, I went to collect some wood for fire. I was about 50 meters from our camp when I saw something hiding in the bushes nearby. I thought it was one of my friends, so I took one stick, threw it in the bush, and yelled, "Ha, gotcha." It wasn't any of my friends. He stood up. I freaked out. It was some middle-aged guy who looked like a drug addict. I started screaming and sprinted to our camp. Everyone was up, and they were like, "What the duck are you doing?" When I told them, they believed me. We started packing our stuff as fast as possible. When we had everything packed, we wanted to go all the way back. But then Nathan said, "Guys, you should see this." We asked him what we should see, and he pointed out the way we came here. There was a ducking bear trap on the ground. "What should we do?" Oliver asked. I just told him we should get the hell out of there. About 2 miles away from where we were camping, I noticed that someone was following us. I told my friends, and all of us started running. When I said all of us, I meant that guy as well. He was on our asses for like 2 miles but then stopped, turned around, and just vanished. When we arrived at the nearest town, we called the cops. Don't know what happened afterwards, but I hope they got him or anything. This post details my encounters in Pisgah National Forest over this past weekend. I went with one friend who will be referred to as B. I will post objective observations, followed by our, possible, interpretations, followed by my own questions. So we arrive late and park at Table Rock. There are quite a few campers already set up in their tents. After eating, we decide to sleep in the bed of the pickup truck and watch the stars. B went and took a shit over in the woods, and did not bury it, like one properly should have done. So fast forward, and we're chilling in the bed of the truck. I notice one star in the sky that looks a different color and is moving around quite a bit. It's hovering in the same general area, but it's going left, right, diagonally, up, down, etc. Upon looking even closer, the star looks more like a circular prism for the main body with other, smaller circular prisms that are folding in towards the main body. I tell my friend, "Look at that star, it's moving." He identifies the star immediately and confirms that he sees it moving as well. He also confirmed the circular prism thing upon closer inspection. I may not have perfect vision, by the way, but it's good enough to drive, and B had his contacts in, so he had perfect vision at the time. I actually get scared of the star for a bit because I feel like it knows I'm watching it and is increasing in activity. It may have even looked like a humanoid figure for a second or two. So I hide in the truck for a bit before regaining confidence and going back out. I decide to look at a different star to see if I can create the same effect with my mind, therefore proving that it isn't the star itself. So I pick the next brightest one, which is located a seemingly perfect 90 degrees from the first one. This star seems normal at first, but then starts moving around and doing the exact same thing the other star was doing. It seems to be picking up activity as I'm intently staring at it. Unbeknownst to me, B was already skeptical of this particular star as well. He confirmed seeing the same thing, movement and circular prisms, when looking at this other star as well. Still, it was much less pronounced and was a normal color. The original one had like an orange glow to it instead of the more traditional star-colored white. All the other stars in the sky were normal and did not display any such activity. Next up we hear a stick smack loudly into a tree exactly where B went to go take a shit. B claims to have then heard some angry ape-like sounds with footsteps moving through the trees closer to us in the parking lot. I did not hear the latter, but I definitely heard the stick smack. It was pitch dark at that point, and there was seemingly no human activity in the area aside from tents on the opposite side of the parking lot. B has a feeling that he pissed off something territorial with his shit, so we get into the truck and sleep there. Later on, I have no idea what time or how long I was in the truck. I notice maybe 2 to 4 groups of campers leave at right about the same time. 2 to 4 cars load up and depart. It's still pitch black at this point. The human activity gave me comfort, and I used the opportunity to sleep. Our thoughts: we think B may have pissed something off with his shit. Once we got in the truck, it couldn't get at us like maybe it planned. So it redirected its anger towards the other campers in the area. This may have reached a breaking point where several groups of campers said, "Duck this," and got the hell out of there. Anyone else was going to stay in their tent no matter what. It was still pitch black at the time, so it's unlikely that people were finishing hikes, especially not multiple groups at the same time. One car in particular pulled out of the parking space before everybody got in, which may be a sign of being rushed or simply trying to move quickly. My questions: does anybody have any info on Table Rock? Apparently, it used to be a place where Native Americans did sacred ceremonies. I haven't found any info on what type of ceremonies or anything at all. Anyone seeing this happen to be one of the campers over this weekend? Did you experience anything? Has anyone experienced anything weird at Pisgah National Park in general? Has anyone ever seen star activity like that before? We feel that Table Rock may be a hotbed of activity. The next day we drove to the other side of the park and went backpacking in the Linville Wilderness. We had no intention of attracting any unwanted attention. Nothing crazy happened overnight. I did see a lot of shadows outside the tent, but I didn't hear any noises, so I figured I was either hallucinating or it was somehow natural. I have hypnopompic hallucinations quite frequently, so I didn't think much of it. Heard voices while hiking. Let me set the stage. 10 years ago. I was fit, in my late 30s, hiking up a steep grassy slope in the Wasatch Front in mid-July, late afternoon, with a clear line of sight all around me, alone with nobody in the vicinity. Relatively quiet with the noise of the small city far below. I'm a medic and former wildland firefighter and SAR tech with extensive outdoor experience. No medical problems, not under the influence of any substance, clean bill of mental and physical health. Well hydrated, rested, and fed. All systems normal. About 30 minutes into my hike up this steep slope, I started to hear people talking and noise like the people were working in a busy backstage-like setting. People calling out directions and instructions as if they were monitoring a live set production or theater. The sound was all around me as if I were in this setting. It startled me, and I stopped, thinking perhaps my phone in my Camelback pack had turned on YouTube or something. When I stopped moving, the sound diminished and went away. I checked my phone, and my phone was locked. Strange, I thought, but I just kept hiking, thinking it was just a fluke or whatever. A minute or so after I kept hiking, it started again. I stopped and immediately thought I might be having a medical episode. I did a self-assessment and had full clarity and sense of time and so forth. It scared me, and I started heading down the mountain because I thought if I was having a transient stroke, I would deteriorate rapidly and probably wander off and die. I would start moving and would start to hear the voices and noise. I would stop, and it would stop. I quickly drank a bunch of water and ate some power gel. thinking perhaps I was having a heat stroke or something, but I had no other symptoms. And then it got really weird. I don't know how to explain this other than by saying what I heard. The voices were talking about me, and they realized that I could hear them. They started shouting out commands that sounded like they were trying to avoid being seen or heard. He can hear us. Everyone back to their positions. Literal arguing and panic about what they needed to do. It's as if there was a little movie set going on in my head that I could hear outside my body. I started running down the hill. I would hear it again, and then I would stop and listen, and it would go away. As if when I stopped, they stopped so they wouldn't be heard. I finally made it down to the trailhead back to my truck and actually stopped someone and asked them if they could hang out with me for a minute because I thought I might be having a stroke. I contemplated calling 911, but it stopped as soon as I talked to this other guy. The guy I ran into was weirded out and left after a few minutes. I got in my truck and drove home. That was it. It never happened again. I felt fine. I followed up with my doctor and had a physical and was weirded out for a few weeks because I was afraid I was going crazy and that this might happen again. It never has, and to this day it really bothers me. My best guess is I was having some sort of medical episode. It was so real and random. Okay, everyone knows that here in Australia, we have a variety of animals, almost all of which want to bite you, whether they are from the ocean, the desert, or anywhere else. As an animal lover, I love, or at least respect, the majority of them. Side note, I'm often in arguments with those who persist in referring to koalas as bears. They are marsupials, people, we only jokingly refer to them as drop bears to scare silly tourists. Live, love, and let live, love I say. Well, maybe you stay in your habitat, I'll try to respect that, but please don't invade mine. Okay, so I'm a coastal girl who likes to surf, but I have great respect that I'm in shark, blue-ringed octopus, and other bitey creatures' habitat, so I may come across as hypocritical. That said, I have to share my story that wouldn't even make a Hollywood movie, it's so crazy. In an awkward and unsafe domestic situation, I grabbed some camping gear and headed into the bush escarpment on the south coast of New South Wales, about an hour south of Sydney. Hiked a fair way up the mountain, which is a combination of scrub and rainforest, wanting to escape confrontation and get some peace. Set up my tent and made a campfire, which technically I was not supposed to do in that region, but I needed the comfort and took precautions to make sure it was contained. Plus the first bitey buggers were already coming for me, damn mosquitoes as large as wasps, so I was hoping the smoke would deter them. Cooked up some food, let the fire go down with the sun, not really looking forward to a troubled sleep in a tent but glad for the solace and peace, apart from the damn crickets and cicadas, that is. Once I was sure the fire was out, I retreated into the tent and tried to get as comfy as possible, already knowing it was going to be a long night. Tried reassuring myself that I could cope, I had all the gear but no idea, as they say. Heard rustling in the trees, assumed birds were going to bed and possums awakening. Heard some strange noises that I couldn't identify but still thought I was okay. Besides, now that the sun had set behind the mountain, even with my head torch and flashlight, it would be a perilous journey down the mountain, safer to stay put. So I thought anyway. Some of those undetermined sounds sounded like they were closer, as well as what sounded like steps. As well as our naturally abundant fauna, unfortunately we do have some introduced species as well, such as deer, rabbits, foxes, etc. I wanted to listen to a podcast, 10 points guess which? But also needed to stay alert because there was definitely activity near me. A few of those damn mozzies had gotten in, so I was already getting bitten and itchy when I heard some grunting/snorting and footsteps. I tried to stay quiet and hoped whatever it or they were would continue on their way. Hey, I'm not here to mess with you, please don't mess with me mentally. Next thing I knew, right next to my head was indescribable snorting, breathing, and ground scraping noises, and then, unmistakably, the sound of liquid against the tent. I caught a glimpse of at least 3 wild feral deer were trying to mark their territory by peeing on my tent. I made loud noises by banging and yelling, hoping to scare them off. Which worked, but they got spooked and managed to take out the tie-down ropes on that side of the tent, so it partially collapsed. And now stunk. I managed to rig the tent back somewhat, but in my haste to fix it, I hadn't closed the tent flap. Great, I thought, I've probably let more mozzies in. Which was true, but unfortunately not the only uninvited guest. I wriggled back to my sleeping bag to discover a small but big enough red-bellied black snake trying to make itself at home. They are poisonous as well as territorial, so in a panic I undid the flap again, quickly bundled the whole sleeping bag up, and threw the bag and snake out. Trying to calm myself down, I resolved that even if it was a cold night ahead, at least I wasn't sharing with a critter who was probably just as scared of me as I was of it. Put on all the clothes I had, tried to sleep on the other side of where the deer urine smell was. Still mosquitoes buzzing. I then felt something tickling my ankle, looked down, and the biggest huntsman spider I have ever seen was looking back at me with its horrible eyes and looking like it was preparing to jump. Technically they are not poisonous to humans, as their fangs are too short to penetrate fully, but we're talking larger than my hand, furry, and not my idea of a tent mate. I will admit, there was no thought process, I just screamed and kicked my foot like a madwoman. It went under my bag, and I fled the tent, hyperventilating and shivering. No way was I going back in when I didn't know where it was, so I relit the fire and spent the rest of the night awake and terrified. I did have a curious possum check me out, I shared some apple with it. But as soon as the sun rose, I grabbed what I safely could and fled the mountain. So anyone hiking Mount Kira, you may come across an abandoned tent and sleeping bag. You are welcome to them, just make sure they are empty. Thanks, Joel, and anyone who listened this long. An alien? Encounter in a weird family house. My older brother is not the kind of person that makes up some hoaxes about paranormal things, but this seemed incredibly weird and not real even to me. Basically, after some time he spent in a bar, being a bit drunk, he, for some reason, decided to go deep into the forest. Perhaps someone told him to do so, or he had planned this already. Worth mentioning is that in the village we've lived in is allegedly located a World War II German bunker along with an old airstrip. So he went into the forest and, as he stated, found an entrance inside the bunker. Inside he had seen a maybe white figure of a man. A figure left no tracks in the snow and had a small talk with my brother. He decided not to tell anyone about what they had a conversation about, but everything he told us was that some bad things are going to happen. And, if I'm not mistaken, that happened before COVID or at least at its start. That was so out of my brother's behavior, nothing even close to that ever happened, and nothing similar happened after that. Pretty sure my family forgot about this, but for me it sometimes pops up in my mind. Once while sleeping, I started to hear consecutive knocks on the ceiling. These knocks lasted for a different amount of time but had always been the same. And they usually started at night, though. The worst thing about the knocks is that this is actually almost impossible for someone to get into an attic, because a normal way inside was never built, and the only way to get there is to bring a ladder, climb onto the roof, open a wooden lid, and squeeze inside. Also, there is actually nothing inside of the attic except a big water reservoir for a very old boiler that is placed in a different position from where the knocks have been heard. They never occurred before and never after. My mom was called by her name in the middle of the night. At that time we were alone in the house. It might sound very stupid, but that is what she told me the next day. In addition to this, once she was preparing and cooking for a birthday in the building that is separated from the main house, basically a kitchen, and stayed there till the late night. As she then told me, she felt a very weird and sudden urge to lock the house and the kitchen. After about 10 minutes, someone started banging and pulling the kitchen door. Scary to think what could have happened if she didn't lock the doors. Also, all of us from time to time felt a creepy presence, especially my grandma, who went alone into the house to pour plants with water. That scared her so much, she ran away outside, and now she doesn't go there alone anymore. Perhaps it's somehow connected to the fact that that exact house is actually connected to all the bad things my mom ever had in her life, but who knows? This is a story about my favorite puppy, Baby, whom I will always dearly love. Baby was a present from my only brother. There's just something very special about Baby, anybody who's ever met him will tell you. Baby is quite intelligent for a dog and even seems to have a peculiar sense of humor. He's one of those pets who is only loyal to one person, me, of course. Baby tended not to like any of my boyfriends and is very protective. Finally, though, I met this guy, who I'll refer to as George, who was able to make a connection with Baby. Whenever George would come over to visit, he'd bring a nice treat. Slowly over time they finally bonded, and we all got along together quite well, but Baby was always my dog first and foremost. George loved the outdoors and going hiking. At first we would go alone, but eventually I was able to convince him to let Baby come along. Baby absolutely loved the outdoors and would often run ahead of us to explore. I never kept him on a leash, he was so well behaved. George liked to play fetch with Baby as we walked through the woods. I should mention that George would always carry a handgun whenever we went for a hike. He had served overseas in the Special Forces and said you could never be careful enough. George taught me how to shoot at a gun range for what he said was just in case. Eventually we started to do some backpacking trips, which culminated in a trip to a well-known upstate mountain range. This would be a 2-day trip to reach a beautiful view at the mountaintop. The first day the trail was quite steep and slow going. We had gotten a slow start, and as night began to fall, we came across a small shelter on the side of the trail. We decided to make camp there as it seemed just perfect. Sometime not too long after we finished dinner, there came the sound of another party making their way up the trail. It turned out to be a group of 3 teenage boys and their dad. Rain was just starting to fall, and the father asked us if we could share the shelter with them. They looked like locals ill-equipped for the trip and were lugging a huge cooler amongst them. George pointed out the shelter was too small to hold everyone. The father replied they had no intent to turn back or go on, we would just have to make do. At this point, George empathetically said no, they weren't welcome. Baby was lying beside me and started to growl. Again the father argued, stating the shelter was public and they had just as much a right to it. George just shook his head. Okay then, asshole, the father finally said with a frown. The rain was coming down steadily now. They went over to the other side of the trail and set up a tarp to shelter under. It turns out they had brought a small grill and charcoal to cook their greasy steaks. Baby intently watched their every move. I should mention the boys were quite big, like their dad. I could see them staring at us over the firelight as they chewed their meal in the rain. Eventually I had to go, if you know what I mean. George told me to go behind the shelter and be quick. I got out of my sleeping bag and put my boots back on. Baby followed beside me as I made my way around the shelter and squatted. I heard a twig snap and looked out into the forest. Even though it was dark, I could make out the shape of one of the teenage boys watching me. Baby immediately let out a loud bark and shot out into the darkness. As I pulled up my pants, I could hear the father talking again. He must have come back over to the shelter and was arguing with George. I heard Baby barking as he chased after the teenager. Baby! I called out, but he didn't return. There came the sound of a scuffle inside the shelter. I came back around the shelter to see the father was grappling with George. One of the other boys had come across as well and menacingly flashed a knife at me. He had this creepy smile, which revealed a few missing teeth. Then there came a stark scream from behind the shelter. Baby must have got a hold of the creep that had been watching me. The boy holding the knife yelled, "Tom!" and ran off into the woods. The other teenage boy who had come across the trail now was holding a big stick. He dove into the shelter and immediately started hitting George. One of the other boys had come back and started towards me. I sprayed him in the face with bear mace. Immediately he dropped to his knees screaming bloody murder. I heard barking again as Baby crashed through the foliage, leaping into the shelter. I should mention Baby is a Rottweiler and was full grown. His jaws clamped down on the teenager's arm holding the stick. I could literally hear bones snapping as he screamed and Baby twisted back and forth. By now George had gotten on top of the father and drew his pistol. "For the love of Jesus, call off your dog," he cried. George got up watching him. "Baby, let go," I said. The boy was sobbing like a baby as he cradled his ruined arm. "Get the hell out of here now," said George. Baby growled again, baring his teeth. The other boy had returned, standing silently beside the shelter. Baby started barking again as the 4 of them ran away, heading back down the mountainside as fast as they could go. "We're going to have to go," George told me. "I don't want those rednecks messing with the SUV." Quickly we packed up and started our way along the trail. Time passed quickly as we hiked in the darkness, Baby leading the way. By the time we reached the trailhead, we could hear a vehicle revving as it peeled out of the parking lot. George drove us to a motel where we spent the rest of the evening. Baby lay at the foot of the bed, sleeping like a child. It would be some time before we went hiking again, but we never returned to that mountain. Summer camp. Last summer, I was a camp counselor. I live in Northern California, and anyone who has explored the forests knows just how beautiful they can be. I'll start with saying that, since the age of 9, I have been a camper at this particular summer camp. It was this summer that I decided to work there. A little layout of the camp, it was roughly a 2-hour ride on a school bus filled with rowdy children. Nonetheless, it was great. When you drive into the little roundabout to unload the bus, you're facing this huge welcome sign. To the right was this large, 2-story, part recreational, part educational building. As you walk forward, you see a bathhouse, a campfire, the other bathhouse, cabins, and tent city. Past the tent city and the lower bathhouse, there's a long dirt road that leads to the amphitheater, then a large barn that stored the water equipment, then the lake. This story happened in the middle of the night. One night, I was sleeping in my hammock I had set up outside the tent. My campers were all asleep, and it was finally the time where staff could lay down, check our phones, and get some peace and quiet. I had been with some other counselors prior, just sitting on a bed outside a tent, but we decided it was time to get some sleep. So at this point, I was in my hammock, and I had just put down my phone, ready to sleep. A few minutes pass, and I'm finally almost sleeping. But then it hits me. Everyone's worst fear. Being nice and comfy. Then getting the urge to pee. Yup. I had to go to the bathroom, which was a fair walk away. I moodily got up, slipped on some shoes, and turned my phone on for the flashlight. I felt comfortable walking in the dark, as I had grown up walking these trails and pathways. I felt more comfortable here than in any other wooded location. I was walking as I heard a rustle. I thought nothing of it, probably just another person heading to the bathhouse. Maybe someone is just moving in their bed. But then I heard it again, only it was faster. Then more rustling. I was surrounded by tents filled with campers and counselors, all sleeping outside. I felt secure, nothing could happen, right? Well, I was wrong. I felt a small gust of wind behind me, and I froze. The rustling is now on the other side of me. I started speed walking and made my way to the bathhouse. I quickly went in, did my business, and left. I looked around before leaving. Now, the female side of the bathhouse is on the front side, so as you're leaving, you can't see down the road to the lake for a few seconds. So I looked around towards the other side and saw nothing. Satisfied, I quickly headed back to my hammock. What I saw next terrified me. I glanced down that road, and to my horror, I saw a figure. It looked like a person, maybe a young boy, almost on all fours. His hands and feet were on the ground, but knees weren't. The only lights were on the bathhouse, and there was just enough illumination to see this little figure. Then, another figure appeared from the brush. I figured it was a couple campers messing around, because let's be honest. 9-12-year-old boys in the woods, supervision asleep? They, and even the girls, like to do some random shit. I quietly said hey and told them to go back to their tent. They just stayed still and stared. I took a step toward them and said it again, a little firmer. Come on, it's time for bed. Let's get you boys back to your tent. I took another step forward, and the first boy growled. Not a child pretending to growl, it sounded like a demonic snarl. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. I don't know why I didn't do this earlier, but I shined my phone's light, and what I saw scared me. These were not campers. Both creatures were wearing shredded clothing, and their skin was dirty and, in a way, looked as if it was burned. Maybe it was just the lighting, but I swear, their eyes were practically non-existent. It almost looked as if they were just there and waited for morning to come. To whatever was in those woods, what the actual duck. I never saw it before, or since. And I hope I never do again. Brown Mountain Lights in NC. This happened years ago on a Boy Scout camping trip along the Appalachian Trail in western NC, but I remember it as if it happened yesterday. We stopped along the trail for the night in a small clearing that allowed us to see the surrounding mountains and down into the valley below. We were miles away from any signs of civilization, no streets, towns, roads, cars, or houses. Completely surrounded by the forest. Not long after the sun had set and the sky was lit by our campfire and small flashlights, we began to see hundreds of different colored floating orbs of light along the mountainside into the valley below. The orbs were slowly fading between red, green, yellow, and orange. These orbs could be seen passing behind trees, just slowly drifting about. We sat and watched them for about an hour, then they slowly disappeared. Some were even close enough to the camp that we could have tried to touch them if we wanted, granted we would have had to hike down the mountains for a few minutes in the dark. The lights never came close to entering the camp, and no one was scared or afraid. Living in NC most of my life, I have heard stories and theories as to what they are. The general consensus seems to be ball lightning, but these seem like something completely different. There are reports and news articles stating how people usually see one or two for several minutes at the most. But seeing hundreds of orbs was a unique and unexplained event that I will tell of to my last days. Has anyone seen or experienced anything remotely similar? Running feet haunting at camp in Alaska. My family took over running a small camp on a quiet lake about an hour outside Anchorage in Alaska more than a decade ago. We've continued the job for 14 years now, and we knew pretty quickly it was haunted, or at least the main building was. Our main building houses the kitchen and dining hall on the bottom floor and what we call the apartment on the second and third stories. The apartment serves as female staff housing. Our first year there, the new camp director slept in the room at the top of the stairs in the second story of the apartment. Her youngest 3 daughters shared a room that was only accessible by going through her room. I, the new camp archery instructor, shared a room on the first level of the apartment, above the kitchen, with the camp medic, a third-year staffer. We all had a curfew, 10 p.m., and for anyone upstairs to come in or out, they'd have to walk through the camp director's room. The first time the camp director heard running feet was the first Monday of camp. It was sometime between 11 p.m. and midnight. She heard feet running across in front of the dining hall. They stopped halfway down the sidewalk. She assumed someone was sneaking a late-night snack from the kitchen, probably one of her daughters, and went back to sleep. The next day they reminded her that their room was in hers, and it couldn't be them. That's when she decided it was me or my roommate, instead. She talked to us all about curfew again, with a heavy reminder that there were bears in the area and that she would fire us if we were caught stealing from the kitchen. We also had our own kitchen, so there was no reason for us to go into the main kitchen after 10 o'clock. We had no idea what she was talking about, but that didn't keep her from accusing us and berating us about it for 4 or 5 weeks. Eventually she stopped bringing it up, but neither the medic nor I felt cleared of the crime. The camp director started watching out her window for the source of running feet, but even when she heard them, she wouldn't see anyone on the paved walkway. That's when she realized the camp was haunted. She didn't tell anyone else. Second year, the camp director swapped rooms with me and the medic. We thought it was punishment for curfew violations we hadn't committed, and it wasn't long until we started to hear running feet, sometime between 11 o'clock and 12 o'clock every few nights. We'd liked having a room downstairs, where we could stay up late without bothering her daughters, so we were determined to catch the actual culprit and get our room back. We tried various methods of watching/listening for running feet, but while we could hear them, there was never anyone there. Still, we weren't about to cry ghost. We assumed someone was playing a prank of some kind on us and were even more determined to catch them. We tried cameras and hiding in the dining hall, all sorts of things. We never found anyone. Eventually we complained to the camp director about someone playing a prank on us, even though we couldn't quite figure out how they were doing it. That's when she fessed up about running feet, and her certainty that it was a ghost. She'd had reports from adult chaperones that came to camp with the camp groups about running feet and had started saving the camp evaluation forms with references to it for herself. I still work there, and every year a handful of adults will tell us that camp is haunted and share their own encounters with running feet. Most of them go pretty much the same way. I was charging my phone in the dining hall when I heard feet running outside. I looked out the window to see who it was, and nobody was there. This is a true hiking/camping story that happened to me about a year ago. A little backstory information: my mom was in the army long ago. She did her time a few years ago. She felt a void in her heart, like something wasn't there, and then she found her love for camping and hiking. My mom has been a camper for 6 years now. She has planned every year for her hiking/camping trips. She's been in the army, so being prepared is nothing. She has gone hiking and camping in the summer, spring, fall, and hell, even winter in the same mountains. All while my brother is her hiking/camping buddy. And it's to the point that the little town, before you head into the mountains, knows my mom and brother, calling the mom who hikes with her son. I live with my dad, and usually, I visit her and my brother over the summer. Last year was my last time hiking and camping with her and my brother, and honestly, I'm not too fond of those mountains and what lies in those woods. The mountains I hike are called Pine Creek Gorge, or, in this case, the Grand Canyon of PA. The West Rim Trail is a 30-mile hiking trail. When I say I'm not too fond of these mountains, I do mean it. My mom wanted to beat a new record with my brother and me to hike this 30-mile trail in under 47 hours. I didn't argue and agreed that we could do it. But in reality, I absolutely could not believe my mom. You see, you park your car at the trail's starting point at the Brady Walls picnic area, hiking this to Rattlesnake Rock. Then you have to hike another 10 miles down the mountain to get to a little town where we get sandwiches, soda, and our ride back to the Brady Walls picnic area. Where it begins. We had met halfway through our hike. It was getting dark, and we needed to set up camp. Luckily, we were at a campsite made for this. We're up high in the mountains, and had a view. The woods surround it. My mom and I set up the tent, and my brother set up the inside. We change our so-called PJ and create a massive fire. This helps keep the animals and insects away, make our food, eat it, and my mom hangs up the food bag in a tree, to keep animals out of our food. It's to remember this food bag. And we settle into sleep. And that's when it happened. I remember waking up in the middle of the night. Pitch black and blurry. I don't know why, I just did it. And that's when I heard it. I don't know how to describe it fully. It sounded like a porcupine call, but deeper and more un-animal than turning into a bird-like sound. It was about 5 minutes, but it felt like hell. I heard shifting around the tent as if it was walking towards the tent. It stops. I listened to the sound of water pouring. And that's when it hit me. It was freaking peeing next to our tent on my side. I kept hearing shuffles around our campsite. I could turn around to see my mom figure upright in the tent. She asked in the lowest voice I had heard, "Do you hear that too?" I replied yes. We waited a few minutes still, and then my mom finally got up, took her machete, bear mace, and a banded flashlight, and went outside to investigate. If you are wondering where my brother is now, He's still asleep. And to those wondering why he did not go and investigate, my brother was 11, tall, skinny, and had a baby face like no other. So having a 40-year-old army woman stationed in Afghanistan with a license to kill and a mama bear on top of that is the way to go. Anyway, I waited a few minutes with my mind rushing. What was outside? Is mom okay? Is it fight or flight? Where do I go? When I was thinking about what would happen, my mom accidentally hits the tent with bear mace. My brother and I started to cough, feeling our lungs suffocating through this mace, and ran out of the tent into the night. We could only see the small fire pit still burning and my mom standing outside, looking frantic. She asks why we are out. I told her about the mace. She said sorry. And we stood in silence. I kept my side beside the fire, and my eyes glued to the deep, dark, dense forest only a few feet from me. My mom said she saw nothing outside. About a good 20 minutes go by making sure the mace evacuated our tent. We went back to the tent and played down. My brother went back to sleep. My mom and I had a difficult time falling asleep. The idea that something was there in the woods, something, waiting for us. By the distance, I heard a pack of coyotes howling, and I remembered all the skinwalker stories I had learned and heard throughout my life. My eyes felt heavy, and I fell asleep afterward. When we woke up, I first walked to the place where I listened to the peeing, and it was clear that the day was still wet and smelled like a strong scent of urine. So we get dressed, use the bathroom in the woods, eat, and pack up. And we were counting on hiking the mountains about 11 miles from our last stop. We found a place. It was early, noon, and lunchtime. My mom asked what we wanted. As she reaches for the food bag, she opens it, and half of our food is gone. She looks wide-eyed and her mouth gaping. I looked at her, and she looked at me. She said this that sent a chill down my spine to this day. I wasn't very honest with you, kiddo. I did not want to scare your brother, so I lied. I did see something. Is what she said. She explained why she sprayed the bear mace. When my mom got out of the tent, she heard the sound of feet near the tree where the food was hanging. She flashed her light in the direction of the sound, seeing a tall shadow figure lit up like a man. She, of course, does the thing attack first, ask question later with the bear mace. It fled toward the tent. My mom kept spraying the mace till the thing ran into the woods, not on the trail, into those dense, dark woods. Before we got out, she went back to the tree and saw the bag swing in the tree, thinking nothing of it. I think it was just a man messing with us, my mom always says. But I think it was something else, the strange sounds, the tall figure, how it made no sound of coughing when my mom sprayed it with bear mace. We are in the middle of the mountains where no other soul is around. And if it was a man, why make those sounds, pee next to the tent, still our food? You need hot boiling water to eat that. We finished our hike. I did what I usually do, and I crossed it from the bridge that separated us from the town. Turn around and flip off towards the mountains and shout how much I hate them. Then turn around and walk to the small town. The woods aren't a place to mess around. With beauty comes fear, but fortunately, I managed to leave those woods unscathed. I saw something while working cows. Some backstory: this was 2 days ago. My family owns about 80 acres of land, and we lease it to my grandfather for his cattle since he has many. He has about 3 farms that he owns personally, but he needed more space to put his other 20 heads of cattle. But now I'm getting to my story. My grandfather called me at around 8:56 at night saying that he had lost track of one of the newborn calves and he needed my help. We met at the old bunkhouse on our property. He said we needed to split up and search the land, and we took off with our 4-wheelers. I drove around the upper, more forested area of the place. I came around, and the sun had finally set. It was dark now, so I turned on my lights and drove through trees. I kept searching for the calf, but I couldn't find it. I stopped my 4-wheeler, and it was quiet again. I pulled out my flashlight and decided to look on foot for a minute. I walked a while away from my 4x4, and I heard some light rustling, so quiet that I don't know how I heard it. I slowly turned my head in the direction and slowly shined my light on where the sound was. It was the calf. But it was in the lap of a something. I can only describe what it looked like. It was sitting with the calf in its lap. It had one hand on its back and one in its stomach. Its eyes were huge, and it had no pupils. Its head was skeleton-shaped, but its skin was wrapped so tightly that you could see the skull inside of its head. Its nose was 2 holes below the bridge of said nose. It looked like it didn't have a mouth. Just smooth skin, but there was blood covering the spot where a mouth should have been. We sat there staring at each other for at least 5 minutes. That's when it started opening its mouth slowly and rolling its head back. Its mouth opened wide, and it bent down to its neck. Its teeth were profile, and they all curved back towards the throat. It didn't have a tongue, and you could see down its throat. It didn't scream or yell or anything really, it just quietly screeched and then slowly came back to the state that it was in before. I forgot to mention that it was as tall as me sitting. It pulled its hand out of the calf and started standing slowly. I forgot to mention that its hands weren't exactly big, but they were long, and its fingers didn't have fingernails, but instead the fingers were sharp points. When it finally stood all the way up, it was, if I estimated, 10 feet tall, and I was 6 feet 0. It took a step forward, and I finally snapped out of it and turned around and sprinted to the 4x4. As I ran, I looked back, and it was following me, but it seemed like it was saying, "Hey, wait," and as I thought that, it took 2 strides, and it was 5 feet away from me. I hopped on the 4x4, and it was trying to start. I looked back, and it was looking down at me, and its sharp claws were coming towards me slowly as if it were trying to console me while I grieved at a funeral. I started it and took off, and while I was driving over the roar of the engine, I heard quick footsteps behind me, and I left the tree line, and I rode down the hill and stopped and looked up. It was there, looking at me, still the same abstract look on its face, and it just walked back into the woods. The day after I came back to the same spot I saw it the day before, there was a trail of blood that led to a field in the back of the property, and all there was left of the calf was some bones with little meat on them in a pile, and right next to it was its skin. I was going to bury it, but I had forgotten to bring a shovel. I left and got one, but when I got back, the pelt was hanging from the wall of the bunkhouse. I looked up on the hill, and it was watching me. And last night, when it was really quiet and I was close to asleep, I heard some twigs snapping outside my house. I looked out the window from behind the blinds, and I saw a pair of white eyes staring back at me. The Night of Screams. The Night of Screams has become a strange memory for 2 of my friends and me. It was an early fall night somewhere between 2017 and 2019, and we were planning on exploring a brickyard in town. We wanted to be inconspicuous about it, so we parked a few blocks away and began our walk. We were talking quietly amongst ourselves down a street when a woman screamed from maybe a street over, piercing the air for a short time, and then stopped, and it didn't sound like my kid jumped out from the corner and said boo type scream. It sounded like real fear. We froze in place. Eventually, my friend, who we'll call Nick, said, "Are we going to talk about this?" My other friend, who we'll call Sean, said, "We're not going to talk about this here," and we all promptly ran off. We had no idea what to do or what to make of what could have caused her to scream like that. I don't know if it was the right thing or not, but we decided to continue to the brickyard. We went up a hill that took us behind the yard so no one saw us walk in from the street. We went slow to play it safe in case we saw anyone else. While we were creeping our way down, we heard another scream come from up in the woods around us. I didn't hear it clearly, but my friends did, and they both seemed unnerved over it. We hung around for a bit before sneaking through the main part of the factory toward the road and then back to Sean's car. Once we were back at the car, we decided to drive outside of town to this old train trestle that goes high above the river. Yes, that's what we do for fun in our small town. We hiked uphill through the woods in shoes that were not made for hiking because it was aesthetics over logic back then, and made our way to the start of the trestle. Heights were never a problem for me. I liked the feeling of being out there, but being over the river in the darkness was always a bit freaky. As we were testing our nerves and walking further out towards the middle of the bridge, we heard another scream come from the other end. At this point we were all thoroughly creeped out. We made our way back to the car and called it a night after that. But that is something we still look back on and wonder, what the hell was up that night? The Wolf Whistler. Quick preface. My uncle was a sheriff's deputy and search and rescue officer in the Northwest United States back in the 1990s. This experience is told from my uncle's view with a few explanations from myself. He asked that I keep the location hidden for anonymity purposes. So it was the summer of 1992. I was a couple of years into my job with the county sheriff's office. Summers were busy. A ton of people would go camping up here. So naturally people would occasionally get lost. S&R was something I was voluntold to do as a rookie, but I learned to love it. Helping people, especially in life or death situations, was the reason I became a deputy. So S&R gave me that rush, as my normal law enforcement duties were almost always mundane in my small town. Anyway. Sigh, here we go. We received a call from a lady in Arizona one Tuesday morning. She claimed her husband and young grandson had driven up here on Friday for a weekend camping trip. They hadn't returned Monday as scheduled, and she was worried they were lost. So we geared up the S&R team, consisting of myself, 4 other deputies, 15 civilian volunteers, and 2 bloodhound S&R dogs. We made it to their camping site around noon. Upon first inspection, everything in the camp seemed relatively normal. We searched their tent and found all their belongings sitting inside. Truck keys, wallet, map, water, and food all sat in the tent undisturbed. A small pot filled with water and, now extra soggy, macaroni noodles sat above a long-dead fire pit. It was obvious they had left in a hurry. No tracks were visible to determine what direction they went. So we used a pair of socks we found inside the tent as a base smell for the hounds. They caught the scent and started leading us north of the campsite. As we walked, I looked at my partner, and we both shook and lowered our heads. North of their campsite was tens of thousands of acres of dense woods. We knew this was going to be a long search. As we searched, we used a grid pattern. A grid pattern is roughly an acre-sized square on a map that and are used to determine a more precise direction that someone might have gone. The weirdest part was that the hounds would pick up their scent in one square, but not in any of the squares directly next to that square. This happened multiple times. It was as if someone plucked these guys up from their campsite and placed them in random sections of the forest repeatedly. I began to get a very bad feeling after this. Something just didn't seem right about the situation. The team had covered roughly 3 miles of area as the day started to wind down. As dusk began to hit, it was just myself, my buddy Rob, and his hound Russ that stayed behind. The rest of the team made their way back home and would be back out tomorrow morning. I always stayed out overnight when a child was lost. I had a feeling of guilt being in a warm, safe bed while a child was cold and scared out in the wilderness. We eventually found a small clearing to make camp. By the time night fell, we had a fire blazing and our sleeping bags laid out in the grass. Rob and I went over the next day's search plan for a bit, ate dinner, and eventually hunkered down for the evening. I lay on my sleeping bag and quickly dozed off. I woke up some time later. I sat up and looked around as my eyes began to adjust to the darkness. I felt like someone was watching me. The urge to look around to ensure no one was sneaking up on me was intense. I called out, "Hello? Sam? Frank? Is that you? We're looking for you. Are you there?" I didn't hear any response, so I lay down and tried to fall back asleep. Just a few minutes later I heard it. Somewhere to my left, past the tree line, came a loud wolf whistle. Uncle does the whistle. A wolf whistle is the whistle you hear in movies or TV when a man sees a very attractive woman. I sprang up out of my sleeping bag and began frantically scanning the tree line. At this point Russ was up too. His ears were peaked, and he was whining in the direction of the whistle. I called out again. "Hello? I'm a deputy with the sheriff's office. Do you need help? Sam? Frank?" I received no response. Rob was awake now, and as I was explaining the situation, the whistle came again. Uncle whistles, but this time to our right. I drew my sidearm and flicked on my flashlight as Rob took out his large buck knife and stood beside me. We scanned the tree line, but we didn't see anything. We continued scanning the tree line and calling out for another 10 minutes before we decided to get the fire going again and wait until dawn to search the area. We didn't hear another whistle for the remainder of the early morning. As dawn broke, Rob and I searched the area. We found 2 pairs of boot prints in the fresh mud. We decided to head back home, get some rest, and return later in the day to continue searching. We were only about 200 feet from the clearing when 2 simultaneous wolf whistles came from behind us. As I turned, I scanned the trees. I didn't see anything at first, but as I looked farther back towards the entrance to the clearing, I saw 2 silhouettes standing out in the open. We couldn't see any features or clothing as the morning sun was blinding us. I called out and started making my way towards them when they took off running. I was going to chase them when Rob stopped me. I was puzzled. I said, "Rob. What?" "We're looking for 2 people, and there they are. Stop wasting time." He replied with, "Stop and think for a second. We are looking for 1 male adult and 1 male child. Unless that kid is the next Randy Breuer, there is no way he's that tall at age 11. That's when the realization hit me. He was right. Those 2 silhouettes obviously were not the 2 people we were searching for. If I had been alone or with another deputy, I would have chased them, but I wasn't willing to put a civilian volunteer in danger. We decided to just continue our way back to the trailhead and debrief the team and sheriff on the events that had transpired. The rest of the hike back to the trailhead was uneventful. We met up with the search team and the sheriff when we arrived as they were getting geared up to head back out. We received a few scoffs and eye rolls when retelling the events that occurred, but the sheriff surprisingly believed our claims. He even had one of the deputies carry an M16 for the remainder of the search. We continued our search for 13 days, never finding the 2 missing individuals. A few people claimed they heard wolf whistles while out searching, but I never did again. This mission still haunts me. I've wondered all these years what happened to those 2 and if the 2 silhouettes had something to do with their disappearance. Never go on night hikes. To begin this tale, there are a few things you should know. This happened during my first semester of my sophomore year of college. It was winter at this time, so snow was everywhere, and the moon was usually blocked out by clouds. I lived and went to college in the Black Hills. For those of you who don't know, it's a giant national forest made up of dense pine trees. It also overlaps with Native American reservation land and was the site of many confrontations during Indian relocation, which is important to remember. Finally, like many college students, I like to let loose and have a little bit of fun every now and then. On this particular night, my friends and I had thought it would be chill to drive through a nearby scenic canyon right outside of town, smoke a bit of pot, and look at the stars. We accomplished the first two tasks, the second of which was done with great enthusiasm, but it was hard to look at the stars because clouds were drifting across the sky and blocking up most of it. This is where the story actually takes off. There were 5 of us in total that night. I and one other friend just wanted to head back to campus and maybe play some video games, chill for the rest of the night. The other 3 thought it would be a great idea to find a random trail and take a night hike through the forest. Since majority rules, we went with that option and found a pretty secluded area with several trails winding through dense parts of the forest. We all got out, grabbed some blankets from the trunk to wrap around ourselves because it was just so dang cold, picked a trail at random, and started off. Now, to tell you the truth, I am a pretty jumpy individual that gets spooked easily. Compound that with my heavy anxiety, darkness, and weed, and you have one scared girl that just wants to go home. I did not say anything to my friends, however, because they were having a good time, and I didn't want to ruin it. We had been on the trail for about 20 minutes and had been using the lights on our phones because, again, the night sky was obstructed by clouds. The trail wasn't even halfway done at this point. My friend at the front of the group stopped suddenly and flashed her phone up to the trees on the side of the trail in front of us a few yards. She said, "Do you guys see that?" We all copied her and flashed our phones up there. At first, I thought she was just hallucinating from the weed, but then a shape started to take form. My initial reaction was that it was a bobcat, since it was lower to the ground than a mountain lion and seemed to be crouching. One friend shouted, "Oh crap, it's a deer." I was scared for a second. Another said, "No, it's a rabbit." No one seemed to be able to pinpoint what it was or what size it should be. As we were arguing what it was, it turned its head towards us and its eyes flashed in our phone lights. I gotta tell ya, I've been hunting all my life and have had all types of cats, dogs, cattle, you name it, around me as I grew up. This means I have seen quite a few animals and know how their eyes glow, either from predator or prey. This thing. Its eyes were both that of an animal and completely different, that I did not know what on God's green earth it was. It was not human, animal, or anything I had come across before. It chilled me more than the cold of winter ever could. After it had turned towards us, my friends had died off in their arguing and had begun what I could only describe as a sick, terrifying sort of stare-off between all 5 of us and this creature. Then, it did something that I will never forget for as long as I live. It stood up. I had thought it was a bobcat, my friends had thought it was animals of varying size, but nothing extraordinarily large. As it stood, it kept going higher and higher and higher until it reached what I assumed to be at least 7 3/4 feet, if not larger. I assume it was larger because as soon as it hit that mark, my friends and I all started screaming and sprinting back the way we had come. A trail that took us 20 minutes to stumble through in our state took us only 5 when we were running like our lives depended on it. We all dove into the car, the driver floored it, and we sped all the way back to campus. After catching our breaths, we kept asking each other things like, "What the duck was that?" Or "Did you see that thing?" And also, "Was that real?" That night we all recollected what we saw, solidified that it was not just a hallucination, and decided it was some sort of animal and agreed to move on with our lives. Only, I can't. My friends all told me it was just a bear, to not worry because we had gotten away. I can't believe it. That thing, from what I had seen of it, was emaciated and had protruding bones under its skin. I couldn't see if it was skin or fur, just its silhouette, shadows around it, and flashes of its build. Also, it was the middle of ducking winter, no bears would be out, and they also never ventured to this part of the Black Hills. Remember how I mentioned reservation land around the area? Well, even though I myself am not a Native American, I had grown up on a reservation of the Lakota Sioux, the same tribe that inhabits parts of the Black Hills. They have many, many myths and folklore about various creatures that live in the hills. I took it upon myself to think back on some of the legends that I was told growing up and also asked some of the elders from the tribe that I knew. They gave me some possible answers. I will tell you 2 of them. The first one is an innocent, if not familiar, character from Lakota legends. His name is Shie Tonka. He is their version of Bigfoot. Lakota tribe members and storytellers debate whether or not this is a singular creature or an entire species, but all the same, it is a mostly harmless being that just wanders the forest and can act as an older brother in native stories. Altogether, it would not have been that terrifying if that was what was on the trail that night. However, I unfortunately have to side with the next creature as being the probable one we met. There is a malicious spirit in Lakota myth called Double Face. He takes the shape of a man, sometimes an animal, sometimes something in between. He is also described as looking like an ogre, but I'd like to keep Shrek out of this. His front face is that of a human, if a bit disfigured. If you see this one, you are fine, but not if you stick around. He will try to convince you to take a peek at the face on the back of his head, which, once you look at it, will paralyze you or kill you with a single glance. If it does not kill you, Double Face will finish the deed by beating you to death or eating you alive. That's a common theme in a lot of native lore, cannibalism. I ruled out Wendigos because if it had been one, I would not be alive to tell this story. You may think it's ridiculous that I am putting so much credence on these supposed myths, but until you have seen what I saw in the dark of night in the Black Hills, sat at a campfire with elders as they blessed you with sage, and listened as they provided you with both answers and caution moving forward, you will never understand how terrifying it is to realize that not all legends stay in stories. My first and last hike at night. To clarify, this is not a fictional post. However, this is a chilling experience. These creepy events took place at a local hiking trail I wasn't too fond of. I won't name the trail itself for privacy reasons. I will say it was here in Southern Cali. I went with two friends. For the sake of their privacy, their names for this story will be Jaslyn and Vivian. This trail is a 40-minute drive away from our hometown. This was unplanned, like most of our hikes and destinations. We arrived approximately at 6 p.m. We were all aware that by the time we finish up the trail, it will be dark. We have been walking for about 20 minutes, and this guy with a pretty large stick passes by and tells us to be very careful because of snakes being present. Just by the look on his face, he looked pretty petrified. I normally run into rattlesnakes on hikes, and yes, they tend to look scary, but just give them their space, and they will leave. I didn't acknowledge much of what he said. He hands me the stick he was holding, and I give it to Jaslyn. Normally I would throw it away, but for some reason I told Jaslyn to keep it. It was weird for me to tell her so. But I ignored the weird thoughts I was getting. After walking for an additional 10 minutes, we run into this couple, and normally we greet people on the way up and downhill. The couple asked us if we had flashlights, and we replied with yes. That is when I asked them how far we were away from the springs. The man said another 25 minutes away. We part ways with them and proceed to walk. At this point the sun has finally set, and it's beginning to get dark. Jaslyn brought her taser, a lighter, and hairspray. Then VV brought her flashlight. We had a pretty decent view, thanks to the light provided. This is when things begin to go south. We're literally only 5 minutes away from reaching the springs. As soon as we step 1 foot closer, an adult rattlesnake almost falls on Jaslyn's head. It slithers always pretty fast. Strangely enough, the entire environment started to feel ominous. Jaslyn and VV were also feeling the same way. I'm usually the friend who perennially likes to brush off any thought of fear or negativity. I don't automatically like to jump to conclusions. Jaslyn gets a little frightened when anything scary happens. Yes, that includes running into animals like snakes. As far as I know, VV hasn't really experienced anything terrifying or just an event in particular that makes one genuinely feel fear. It is completely dark by now, and we decided to head back. To give a better idea of how steep it was going downhill, it was dangerous to the point where one wrong step could make you fall off the cliff or slip and get badly injured. Even trying to run is a really big risk. The paths are very narrow. We had to walk behind each other. Fast forward 10 minutes since we've been walking, and we reach one part of the trail that is the steepest. Naturally, I'm used to power walking fast, going along with the flow. VV was pacing herself, going a little slow, and Jaslyn stayed in the middle. I start moving the taser's mini flashlight and see a blurry figure standing in the corner of the trail. I began to slow down, but I was going too fast. I had stopped right in front of it. This was when I noticed Jaslyn and VV were left a little behind. I moved the flashlight up towards the figure's face, and it revealed this putrid-looking guy. It looked like he hadn't showered in months. "Oh shit. You scared the hell out of me," I said in sarcasm, hoping to get a greet back from this man. Nothing. No response. He stares at me with this deranged blank expression. At the same time he really made me feel unsettled. He looked high on something, and I know for a fact it was not weed. Jaslyn and Vivi get closer, and that's when I hear Vivi jokingly say, "I'm surprised you didn't tase him." Even after hearing that, still no response from the man. This is when I begin to look at him from head to toe, just to see if he has a weapon of some sort. The entire time he had one hand in his pants and the other outside. This is when I noticed he was wearing black gloves. To give a description of how the man looked. He had long, greasy hair, filthy pants with bleach stains all over, a really big, oversized hoodie, and a ripped beanie. To top it off, he also had no flashlight. It was at least 8:30 p.m., there's just no way he could see and walk around in the dark with no light. Especially since this trail is almost impossible to walk around at night. Every red flag possible started going off in my head. My unsettling feeling starts to rise. I'm pretty sure at this point the man can see fear all over my face. This is when we leave. Jaslyn tells me in Spanish, Ni siquiera le tengo miedo a las vibras, le tengo más miedo a ese way, which means, at this point I'm not scared of the snakes, I'm more afraid of that way. I told her to stay quiet and to turn off the music. This is when Jaslyn and I begin to run at this point. I didn't really notice that Vivi was left behind. I kept running. I was too scared to process the eerie encounter. Vivi gets a little freaked, and Jaslyn and I had to calm her down. I started to lose a little bit of my patience when she wanted to stop and stand for a few minutes. She was just in complete denial and refused to believe that guy wasn't much of a threat. I couldn't bear standing around, so I began to walk. Luckily, Jaslyn managed to convince Vivi to move forward. The rest of the hike was okay besides the occasional slipping and tripping. Once we reached back to the car, we all said it. He gave me serial killer vibes. After that incident I can now say, never will I return there at night. This happened a couple of years ago, and I still remember it clearly, as it really creeped me out. I grew up in a very strict home. My dad is a preacher, and my mom is a workaholic. So you can imagine what I went through in my teens, as I was very rebellious. I was into gangs, drugs, that sort of thing. I had just gotten out of a 9-month county jail stay and 6 months in boot camp. So I was very excited to smoke some weed. However, I was still on probation, but I had heard about how synthetic weed was popular and easily available. This was music to my ears. Weed that can't be detected? Sign me up. Man, how I wish I had known the roller coaster it was going to cause in my life. Anyway, so if you've smoked synthetic weed, you know it ducks you up pretty bad. My parents started catching on, and soon I had to hide to get high. This was easy because there is a very deep forest behind my house. I would jump the fence and walk until I found a place to sit down and smoke. After about 2 months of this routine, I was walking the trail that takes me to my favorite spot when suddenly, I heard something behind me. As I turned around, I noticed there was a man a couple of yards away walking in the same direction. I looked at him and tried to not show any sign that I had been startled by his sudden appearance. This man was tall and looked pretty worn out. He had crappy clothes and looked like he had come from a homeless shelter or something. There was something very creepy about how he walked. His stare was very disturbing. It felt like he was watching my every move. I could feel his fierce stare even while he was behind me. I turned to look at him, and he didn't even blink. Just stared. I nodded in respect and kept walking. I had just finished boot camp, so I was ready to defend myself. I am also very paranoid. I couldn't stand the fact that this stranger was behind me. So I turned around to look at him. He asked, "Are you okay?" In a mocking kind of tone, probably sensing my discomfort. I said, "Yeah." Awkward. I noticed that even if I slowed down walking, he was making sure he stayed behind me. I even stepped off to the side and pretended to text to watch him pass by, and he walked even slower in a very obvious way. He just kept staring with an evil look in his eye. Kind of like annoyed that I would try to outsmart him. Or he was expecting me to run. He kept following me and staring at me. I probably shouldn't have turned around as much, but damn it, what the hell is he doing? What really bothered me was now he had his sleeves rolled up and was getting closer like he was planning to do something. I played a very desperate move. I stopped in my tracks and said very loudly, "Did you hear that?" I pulled out my butterfly knife and just stared into the woods to our side. He suddenly stopped, and we both stood there in silence. Just waiting. I turned to face him, motioning him to be quiet. I acted like I heard an animal or something. I shrugged it off and nervously said, probably a pig or something." I kept the knife open and in my hand as I walked. Because of all this stalling and walking, I'm pretty deep in the woods now, but I couldn't afford to turn back now. I noticed he was keeping his distance, still staring with a very mean look. Then, he was gone. I was so creeped out I still walked with the knife and just kept checking behind me. Finally, I felt pretty safe. However, I was a bit too far in the woods. I knew if I smoked that synthetic weed, I'd have to walk back all high. At least it was still daylight, because, Trust me, I've smoked back there at night. I know, how stupid. Anyway, I decided to take the main trail that ejects you into the far end of the neighborhood. All other trails end up who knows where. I knew about a clearing where I was going to smoke and then walk back to my house through the neighborhood to play it safe. As I approached the clearing, my stomach dropped. On one of the trunks was the man sitting there. What the duck, in my direction. I don't think he heard me, I just think it was bad timing for me. Duck this shit. I took off running, and not once did I look back. Once I left the trail and went into the woods to jump to my house, I ran through those woods, cutting and scraping my arms and face on the way, not caring. That incident spooked me so much I did not go back till about 3 months later. And I always carried something more effective than a knife, if you know what I mean. A close encounter turned into being stalked in the woods. I'm starting to think the Olympic National Forest isn't the best place for me to get my outdoor fix from. For some context, I'm not a big guy. I'm average height with a lanky build. Maybe that has something to do with this part, or maybe it's something else that has ingrained that habit into me, but if I'm in the woods, dead or alive, you won't catch me without a sidearm. Several years ago, a friend of mine admitted that what her parents called camping was equivalent to going to a hotel. Coming from a long line of outdoorsmen, I jumped at the opportunity to get someone out in nature properly. We started off slow, pitched tents in the backyard, then moved on to a glamping-style campground, then to a less fancy area, and eventually into the bona fide untamed wilderness. All was well. I headed up early and cleared the spot, a flat area on top of a mountain overlooking the Puget Sound. I got the dogs situated, started a campfire, and did my best to make the space as welcoming as I could in hopes of comforting my friend's nerves. My wife, my friend, and my friend's husband drove up, and we all remarked about the view and location. All went well that first night. Some deer and a couple of early morning dirt bikers came through, but nothing off-putting. It was in the peak of summer, and while this spot was beautiful, it lacked a nearby water source. Their 2 dogs, ours, and all the humans piled into my truck as we went in search of a creek. This might be a good time to explain how I find camping and fishing spots. Since I prefer to be far away from people, I hop on Google Maps and pick a general area, zoom in, and follow logging roads around to see if I can get where I want to go, plunk down a location pin to get the coordinates, and boom, off we go. Finding this creek was no different. One of the downsides of that method for finding locations is the satellite images may not be a good representation of how that area presently looks, though. Sure enough, the path to the creek was not ideal. Instead of everyone getting out to see if this was a viable spot, I volunteered to go see if the path was worthwhile for us, especially with 4 excited dogs, to unload and walk down there for. After some ways down, it was apparent that too many trees had fallen and blocked the path for this to be an easy trek for someone already being pushed to their limit with the outdoors. I head back, enjoying the clean air and welcome breeze on the hot day. I round the bend, grass nearly 6 feet tall on both sides of me but a few feet wide of a decent path up to the road where we parked, just up the hill. I don't remember what I was thinking about in that moment, but what I'll never forget is that sound. A sound that shook me to my core. You ever hear a sound bite of a mountain lion for a movie or show? Well, I'll be damned if what I heard, less than 10 yards from me, didn't sound exactly like that. There was no mistaking it. It was only me out there while the rest were inside the truck. That cougar sounded off because of me. I was being warned, and neither of us were happy about it. Immediately I spun a 180 to face what I didn't want to see, only to not see anything. You know, I think that was worse than if I had seen it on the path. When I spun around, like some old western cowboy, I reached for my holster, unclipped it, and had the pistol pulled out by the time I was done with my scared shitless ballerina moves. It was somewhere in that tall grass, and while I couldn't see it, I have no doubt that it could certainly see me. Lovely. I walked backwards up the hill, praying I didn't trip over a rock or something and fall just so this big cat can show me its vocals weren't the only thing that would be piercing my heart that day, all the way up to the road. I'm sure that was quite the sight for the group seeing me emerge onto the road walking backwards with a pistol in hand. Come to find out, I had been gone for long enough that they even discussed how I would communicate with them if I got into trouble. Instead of having a laugh about it, I opened the truck door, got in, shut the door, and then holstered my 9mm when typically I would have done so before even opening the door. I don't remember who asked, but someone asked what happened or something to that effect. All I remember saying was, "We aren't going down there," before turning the truck around and driving off. I wish I could tell you that is where the story ends, but unfortunately it's not. We head back to camp. It's about a 7-mile drive, and it's about 3 miles as the crow flies from that creek. Up and down a few mountainsides and windy roads. We move on from the experience after one-word answers to any question they had. Cougar. We make dinner and forget about it for the most part. I try to but fail. Night arrives, and we are bullshitting around the campfire. I'm doing my best to not draw attention to the fact that I'm incessantly scanning our surroundings. After a while I think I'm just paranoid. Sure, it wasn't happy with me, but I'm not prey, right? And sure, cougars have territories that can be upwards of hundreds of miles, but they aren't like dogs or wolves that track like that, right? Plus, we are a handful of loud folks with a roaring fire and 4 decent-sized dogs. It's all in my head, I thought. The gait of an animal, the way they walk, it's easy to confuse some animals for others, but big cats, nothing moves like a big cat. And sure as hell, what do I see crossing the only road to go to and from our camp about 100 yards away, lit up only by the moonlight and the confirmation of my fears? That wasn't a bear. Not a coyote. Nothing slinks through the night like that except for one thing, my dear old friend, the mountain lion. I had officially been pimp-slapped with the reminder that humans aren't at the top of the food chain out there. The realization that the saying they are more afraid of you than you are of them is something only said by someone who hasn't been stalked several miles and several hours later after driving a vehicle and leaving virtually no trail behind. The reminder that I was the outsider, and I was the one trespassing. We slept in our vehicles that night. While I'll eventually make my way out to the woods again, I think it's safe to say my friend decided the wilderness maybe was a little too wild sometimes. For anyone, no matter your experience level, that is planning to head into nature soon. Enjoy the peace it brings, but never forget, out there you are nothing more than a visitor in someone else's home. Late night woods encounter. This happened last summer and is probably the weirdest/scariest thing that has happened to me. It was a warm New England summer night, and my friend, who I'll call Chris, was sleeping over at my house. Chris and I have always been night owls, so whenever we sleep over at each other's houses, we usually stay up pretty late. We were up at around 2 in the morning, bored out of our minds, trying to think of stuff to do. We are both into the outdoors, so I came up with the idea to go on a short night hike near my house. We brought some firecrackers to light off and some music. Looking back, it was a dumb idea, but whatever. I live on a rural dirt road surrounded by woods, so there are a decent amount of trails near me. We got there, and unexpectedly it was very muddy, and I had dropped my flashlight, which broke it. We were considering turning around, but we ended up just using our phone flashlights. I have been to this place before, and I knew of a pond with a dock that was on the trail that we could go to. The hike to the dock only took about 20 minutes. When we got there we were greeted by hundreds of frogs croaking constantly, which made us a little on edge, but we stayed. We lit off some of those little red firecrackers that make a loud noise but no fire. We started to play some music on our speaker, and we're starting to have a good time when Chris tells me to turn the music down because he thought he heard something. I turned it down, and there was the sound of an engine in the not so far distance. It sounded like an ATV or another type of small vehicle. Now these trails are known to have ATVs, side-by-sides, jeeps, etc., to ride on them, so it's not out of the ordinary to hear those types of noises out there, but all I could think was who the hell would be out riding at this time of night. It was probably around 2:30 in the morning when we heard this noise. I and Chris looked at each other with confused looks. The sound was coming closer, and we decided to quickly pack up our stuff. Whatever vehicle it was coming to our location, and we didn't know what else to do, so we hid in the nearby bushes/ditch. The vehicle had reached us and had stopped just before the opening to the dock and was just idling for a solid 5 minutes there. This is the weird part. Whoever it was had their headlights turned off and most likely used a small flashlight to navigate, so we could not see their location. They were purposely trying not to be seen. Why would anyone with good intentions want us to not see them? Our hearts were pounding, and at this point we were genuinely scared. After 5 minutes, the vehicle left the opening and headed off in another direction. Once we thought it was far enough away, we booked it back to the car, just using my phone screen light to see. On the way back, we saw fresh exhaust smoke lingering and tire tracks on the trail, which means they saw our car at the trailhead and knew we were there. Thankfully we made it back to the car, and while we were driving home, Chris said, "That felt like pure survival," which I thought was a great way of describing the whole situation. Now I've come up with one theory about what was going on that night. Maybe someone was late night cruising on the main road with their ATV and saw our car and thought we were lost and tired. They were helping us, but that didn't explain why they were hiding their location. Besides the whole no headlights thing, I also thought it was weird that someone would be out there at that hour on their off-road vehicle. If anyone has any ideas on what was going on, please let me know. Strange and scary event at the campsite. This event happened when I was approximately 6 years old. To be clear, I have an excellent memory and have very clear recollections of my childhood from the age of 4 on. I can remember things from before I was even at school with incredible precision, and the things I describe here are burned into my mind with great clarity. When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time at a campsite in Sussex. My grandparents, who looked after me and brought me up, used to own a caravan there, and we would go almost every weekend or school holiday. It was a pretty magical place, and in stark contrast to the rest of my childhood and teens, it is responsible for some really good memories of being a kid. The campsite that we used to go to was considered safe ground, in that everyone knew everyone, and that meant that kids like me were allowed to play out well after dark as we couldn't get lost or get into too much trouble. Our parents or guardians never had to worry about where we were free to explore. This campsite had a large lake in the middle of it, and often my grandfather would stay up late for a bit of night fishing. One particular night he and a friend were sitting by the lake fishing, and I was out and about playing on my own. I stood around waiting for someone to catch a fish but quickly got bored when nothing happened, so I wandered away from the caravans further along the edge of the lake. It was quite dark, and there weren't really any lights around once I had walked far enough along, but it was a completely clear night sky, and there was just enough moonlight that I could see where I was going. I stopped at a tree by the edge of the lake and, for no real reason that I remember, decided to walk up to it. This is where my amazing memory of my childhood falters a little bit because I can remember looking at the top of the tree and seeing something, but I don't know what. I remember whatever it was that drew my eyes to that tree meant that I was compelled to stand on tiptoes and reach up to the corner of a branch growing out of it. Then, suddenly, as I was reaching for this area of the tree, something grabbed my hand. Seriously, I'm not making this up, something grabbed me, and I could not move. I felt something that I can only liken to a very sudden electric shock. I remember it was even more disturbing because I couldn't even flex my fingers, my entire hand felt numb, like it was stuck in treacle. I could hear a noise that to this day I have trouble describing. It sounded like a kind of constant but very low-pitched buzz. It was dark, and as I looked up at my hand, I could see nothing. I couldn't even see my hand as everything was in the shadows. All I could observe was what looked like a frantic movement of something just above my wrist. I could make out what seemed like the tips of something dark moving about very rapidly. I tried to pull my hand free, but however much I tried, I could not get it free from whatever had grabbed it. I do specifically remember that sudden shock of my hand being grabbed and this weird numb feeling. By this point, once I realized I couldn't get free, I was screaming for help, really shouting at the top of my lungs, but nobody came, despite the fact that there were caravans and my grandfather and his fishing buddy about 15 meters away. Nobody came to help. Just as total ducking hysteria was setting in, my hand finally came free, and I fell backwards. Looking at the tree above me, I could still see nothing. The feeling had returned to my hand, and I quickly ran towards the caravans to look at my arm. When I got to some light, I looked at my arm. It was slightly red, but other than that there was nothing, no marks, nothing at all. The skin felt a little bit weird, like it was hypersensitive. I shouted over to my grandfather and asked why he hadn't heard me but got no response. He and his buddy were just sitting there. Freaked, I ran to the nearest caravan, where I knew that my grandmother was with the wife of my grandfather's fishing buddy watching TV. I burst in, a total mess, really freaked out. I remember asking my grandmother if she had heard me screaming, but weirdly she seemed to be in a complete daze. She was totally uninterested. I tried to explain, but she and her friend just sat there, looking at the TV like they were in a daze. I ran out of the tent and continued to look at my hand and arm. I then ran back to the caravan and looked through the glass at my grandmother and her friend, then back at my grandfather, completely freaked that everyone seemed to be oblivious or unresponsive to me and what had just happened. By now I was crying and sat on the grass trying to make sense of what was happening. About 2 minutes later, my grandmother's friend came out and asked me what was wrong. Finally, everyone was back, I thought. I tried to explain to her, and she took me inside and looked at my arm. Not understanding herself, she could see that I was seriously distressed and decided, perhaps to try to calm me down, to wrap my arm and hand in a bandage. I was then taken back to our caravan by my grandmother and went straight to bed and lay down. I slept terribly. I remember twisting and turning in the night, my mind reeling with thoughts about what had happened. I went to sleep crying because the whole thing was not making sense. I woke up very late in the morning. Eventually, I must have drifted off into a really deep sleep, and I woke up very refreshed. As I got up, I looked down on my pillow and found it was covered in blood, streaks of it all over. I quickly ran to the mirror and found my top lip and nose caked with dried blood. It seems I had some kind of massive nosebleed during the night. Then I remembered the bandage on my arm. I took it off, scared at what I would find, only to find nothing. No marks, no red patches, no evidence of anything. The only thing I would say is that I remember looking at the bandage very closely and seeing lots of tiny black specks, but nothing else. The whole thing was swiftly forgotten about by everyone except me. My grandparents weren't exactly approachable about this kind of weirdness, so if anything, I was scared to mention it again. To finish, I would note that since then, every now and then I get a really intense pain in that same hand and wrist, to the point where I can't even use it to carry anything. The pain comes and goes at random, sometimes not happening for years at a time, but to this day it still happens. A true scary story that occurred while I and a very close friend of mine were on a night hike exploring some trails at night. Each year, I and one of my closest friends, who we will call Dane, go down to visit his grandparents at their cabin in a nice, small, peaceful town in the North Georgia mountains. I, my friend, and his grandpa are all outdoorsy kinds of people, so we are always looking for something fun for all of us to do around the area. One night we decided to go on a night hike on a trail not too far from the cabin. Now this isn't the kind of trail you're probably thinking of. It really is a gravel dirt road, but a lot of hunters, campers, motorbikers, and backpackers use it. We headed out to the trail, and right as we pulled up to the trail we were going to hike on, we noticed an older, beat-up, suspicious-looking black Chevy SUV with two middle-aged men in it parked next to the entrance of the trail. Now even though this is a safe area, drug deals and other kinds of sketchy activity can occur deep in these woods, so we avoided going on that trail and decided to head down to another trail about a half a mile down the road. We pulled about 50 or so feet into the trail just outside of view from the road, parked the truck, and got out and started our hike. Our hike was off to a great start until we got about a mile in. We started to hear a dog bark from probably about 300 feet away. We decided to keep going, but the dog just would not stop barking, and we didn't know if the dog was on a leash or not and could come attack us, so we decided to turn around and head back. When we were about, I would say, 1,000 or so feet away from the truck, we could see a car sitting behind my friend's grandpa's truck running with its headlights on. This instantly made us worried because who would just roll up behind a random truck at 10 o'clock at night on an isolated trail? Keep in mind you would have had to drive into the trail to see where we parked the truck. It was not visible from the road. We stood there for about 5 minutes trying to see if we could see anybody, but since it was so dark and pretty far away, it was hard to see anything. Fortunately for us, there was a pretty large tree next to the trail we were able to stand behind, so there was no way they could see us from where they were parked. My friend's grandpa took these night vision binoculars we had with us to try and get a better look, but it was still not much help. We decided to just stand there and wait for them to turn around and leave because there was no chance we were going to walk back with this random car with potential bad people in it sitting behind our truck. After about 10 minutes of just standing there, to my absolute horror, the car drives around the truck and starts to head down the trail in our direction. As fast as we could, we climbed up this hill right next to us and hid behind a log that was sitting up on the top. A few seconds later, the same beat-up black Chevy SUV we saw outside the other trail we were originally supposed to hike on comes driving down where we were just standing not even 15 seconds ago. The car had its windows rolled down and started to slow down as it drove past us. Me, my friend, and Grandpa were terrified, our hearts were pounding out of our chests, and we were scared these guys would stop and sit there or, even worse, get out and start looking for us. Fortunately, the car just kept driving and never stopped. As soon as the car was out of sight, we got out of our hiding spot, booked it back to the truck, and got the hell out of there. I know this may not be as scary as some others, but to us it was definitely pretty frightening. We don't know who or what those guys wanted. My guess is they had a stash on that trail deeper in the woods and thought we stumbled upon it or something and were out there to confront us, or even worse. A lot of things could have gone wrong. We could have walked up to the truck just as they pulled in. What if they came out and looked for us? What if they slashed the tires to the truck? Or what if they turned their headlights off and sat there and waited for us to come back? My friend and his grandpa actually went back in the daytime a few days later to the exact spot where we were hiding and took some pictures. They said we were very lucky to have made it up there successfully, as it seemed impossible to do it as fast as we did, especially with all the shrubs and thorns in the way. If we had gotten up there just even 2 seconds later, we would have been seen. I can only imagine what could have happened if we hadn't made it up that hill and those guys saw us. A true story that still haunts me and my friends. I was at a friend's house for the weekend, and it turned out to be a nightmare. This real-life event takes place in the town of Lindale, Texas. If you take the time to research this town, you'll find that it's rather rural and small. The primary activities are hunting, farming, and Walmart. The area really offers little to do. At this weekend gathering there are 4 people, myself, me, Tyler, Casey, my friend, and Brian, the cousin/neighbor of Tyler. Tyler lived away from the main part of town in an area surrounded by pastures and woods. You had to take several back roads in order to get to his house. His neighborhood was all on one short road, and most of the houses were double-wide trailers. So, now that I've laid out what the area is like along with other supporting information, I can get to the story. With all four of us sitting around twiddling our thumbs, a plan to go spend the night in the woods with a campfire and some food comes up. We all agree to this plan and proceed with packing up and begin our movement to the area we'll be staying in for the night. We did not bring tents or sleeping equipment because we intended to stay awake the entire night. Also, we did not bring any firearms, but we had knives and a hatchet. The camping location was not far from Tyler's, approximately 1/4 of a mile away. We arrived while the sun was still up. In order to reach the camping area, we had to cross over a log that lay over a creek bed. I was glad the sun was out because I have terrible balance in the dark, and crossing a log would most likely result in me falling. Once everyone was across, the fire was made, with difficulty, as it had just rained and the wood we used was still damp. Nighttime was quickly approaching, and Tyler looked at us and stated that we must either keep the fire going or leave immediately. This struck me as odd because while making the plans to camp, no concerns came from Tyler or Brian about being out there at night. Turns out no one expected the wood to be so damp and hard to work with. So of course I asked why and what's going to happen if we stay but can't keep the fire going. Tyler informed us that there are strange things he's seen and heard where we were and that a fire would be our only way of keeping whatever it is away. I was very verbal about the doubt I felt for what Tyler had just said. I made it clear that I was no stranger to the woods, really, all of us were, and that scary stories won't get to me. Tyler then made his point very clear with a very serious tone of voice that he isn't trying to scare us, but rather warn us. Seeing there was a spooky wrench in our camping plans, we agreed that the wood was garbage and that we'll leave. Remember that log? I do, and I remember being adamant that I wasn't crossing it in the dark even with a flashlight. My friends all sighed, and Tyler showed us another, much longer way out. No, we did not leave a fire burning and unattended. We made absolutely sure the fire was out by using water from the creek next to us and kicking a ton of dirt on it. Only after the fire was completely out, even the smallest ember was extinguished, did we leave the campsite. On our way out, Tyler would occasionally say that he saw something in the brush just next to us. I actively dismissed what he said and continued on. Suddenly the forest lit up like the sun had come back up, and all of us looked around to see why. Our attention was drawn to our rear, and everyone, in complete disbelief, saw a huge fire roaring at our campsite. Note, I reasonably cannot say why this happened. The size of the fire was entirely unrealistic and impossible for the reason that there wasn't even an ember left in the fire pit. I said to the group, "I've seen this movie before. I am leaving." No one argued, and we continued on with our exit from the woods. After some brush, thorns, and very dense vines, we finally made it out of the woods and proceeded back to Tyler's house. Once arriving, we all sat down in some lawn chairs just in front of the double-wide and talked about the events that had just occurred. I was quick to question the nature of the whole ordeal. Tyler responded by asking his cousin Brian to replicate a noise they've both heard in the woods. Brian recreates this noise with a sort of guttural howling. I was not impressed by this at all because I still felt the whole thing was just a joke. So I asked Brian to make the noise again, which he did to my regret. Just a second after Brian made the sound again, we all heard the most heart-stopping, blood-curdling, nightmarish sound we had ever heard. I can't describe the sort of noise this thing made. All I can say is that when I heard it, my heart sank down into my bowels. I froze in fear. All I knew was, I have to get inside. I could see that everyone else had heard what I just heard, and we all had the same look of complete terror on our faces. Safe to say, we ran inside as quickly as humanly possible. Now, all we could do was wait. While waiting and constantly watching the windows, by just barely peeking out of them due to fear, I realized something. That sound was coming from exactly where we just were. Just down the road. Our last known location. This thing was there and was tracking us. We all understood the sound we heard as a threat. No doubt about it. Whatever was out there was some serious business. We all waited by the windows and doors, now with guns drawn and ready, for this nightmare to walk out and do its worst. Nothing happened. We continued to wait with anticipation and pure fear mounting on our backs like a 100-pound ruck. After about 5 minutes we backed off from the windows and discussed what happened. Trying to make sense of everything helped us a ton, but things still got confusing. After talking, we noticed that the weather had taken a turn for the worse. This is the part of the story that all of the affected parties have a hard time accepting because of the absurdity that you're about to read. Suddenly, the house shook to no end, and there was obviously a small hurricane beating the house we were in nearly to death. Hail, lightning, thunder, strong winds, and constant rain beat Tyler's house nearly apart, seemingly. After the alleged storm, we opened the front door to see the damage. Nothing. Not a fragment of hail, not even the ground was wet from rain. There wasn't even a cloud in the sky. How? How could this be? We all asked ourselves, out loud. This night couldn't get more weird. At this point I, along with all my friends, felt completely crazy and very stressed out. I can't explain what the noise was. I definitely can't explain why a damn hurricane hit Tyler's house so suddenly. I mean suddenly. To this day we all have no idea why this happened or what the noise we heard came from. I have some ideas about what could cause this, and it isn't Bigfoot. The scariest part for me and my friend, Casey, is that we heard this same noise again on his property. Mind you, his property is miles away. This thing would have to travel quite the distance to get here. But, nonetheless, it still showed up again. This has caused me, and all of my friends, a good deal of stress and driven me to root out whatever this thing is. I'm writing this long-ass story for a reason. Not just to share, but perhaps to gain some answers as to what might have happened that night. It started in the late winter of 1978. The three of us, myself, Ronnie, and Tom, were working at an outdoor education program high in the San Bernardino Mountains. The outdoor school had taken over a summer camp for the winter semester. This camp was located in a saddle in the mountains where the mountains narrowed and bent from the tectonic forces that created them. The camp was reached by the rim of the World Highway, which formed the western edge of the camp's property. The rim road ran right along the edge of the mountains, with the camp on one side of the road and a steep drop-off on the other side. The road crossed one of the many rock falls, narrow, rock-filled canyons that start at the top of the mountain and plunge thousands of feet down toward the Los Angeles basin. We had snuck out to the rockfall this particular night because we knew that the view of the city lights below would be spectacular. The Santa Ana, or devil winds, had been blowing from the desert, up over the mountains, and down into the Los Angeles basin for the previous 3 days. The Santa Anas had scrubbed every molecule of smog out of the basin, offering a crystal clear and unobstructed view from 7,000 feet, all the way down the canyon to the city lights below. When we arrived at our spot just before midnight, the scene could not have been any more spectacular. Standing on the other side of the highway in a small paved pullout, the city lights were spread out in front of us like a giant, multicolored carpet of glowing geometric shapes. The major thoroughfares were lit up in different colors depending on the jurisdiction's choice of streetlights. Red and white moving snakes of traffic could be seen thousands of feet below, even at this time of night. We could see all the way down to where the lights ended and the Pacific Ocean lay in darkness. We stood in a loose circle, myself, Tom, and Ronnie huddled up and excited about the amazing sight below us. Ronnie was the one that got down to business, pulling out one of his famous hand-rolled joints. He lit it, as per tradition, and took one hit off of it, waving it in the air as he was telling a story. Following the red cherry arc through the air as Ronnie gesticulated is how I first noticed a bright orangish-white light coming over the top of the mountain behind us. It backlit the mountain and quickly was over the top, traveling down our side of the mountain, following the canyon down towards the basin. We all noticed the change in brightness and turned toward its origin. At first I heard no sounds, but as it grew closer, coming down the mountain in the next canyon over, I heard a sound that, to me, sounded like what I'd imagine an object creating its own vacuum in the atmosphere would sound like. Like the air itself was being ripped asunder. There was no aircraft noise, just a sudden vacuum and an empty place in the air. The UFO was vaguely pumpkin seed shaped, with a brilliant reddish-orange glow at the thicker head of the seed and an orangish-white vapor trailing behind. It came over the mountain and down the canyon at a constant height of 100 feet above the mountain, lighting the ground under it. It followed the contour of the canyon until it reached approximately 2,000 feet above the basin below, where it leveled out and traveled west towards the ocean. It dropped 4,000 to 5,000 feet down the canyon below us, and a couple of miles to the west of us, in less than 10 seconds. The craft was clearly visible, vibrantly glowing, as it traversed at a high rate of speed along its path west. Also clearly visible were the running lights of a small plane flying in a westerly direction, ahead of the UFO. As we watched the blinking lights of the small craft, we witnessed the UFO rapidly decelerating from its incredible speed down the mountain and then stop right next to the small plane. From our vantage point up on the mountain, the UFO was to the left and looked to be at the same altitude and extremely close to the small plane. After matching the plane's speed and vector for 3 seconds, the UFO suddenly accelerated forward, turned to the left, and disappeared over the Pacific toward Mexico. It went from the easternmost part of the Los Angeles basin, down towards Long Beach, and out of sight in less than a couple of seconds, leaving behind only a faint orange plasma trail and a pilot with the sudden need to change his underwear. We stood transfixed, staring at the empty space where the UFO was and then all looking at each other with a mix of awe and panic in our eyes. Ronnie very slowly and deliberately crushed out the joint on the heel of his boot and put it in his pocket. Then we all started talking at once. What the duck was that? Where did it go? Did you see it stop next to that plane? What can do that? Nothing, that's what. It was at that point that the panic kicked in. We all looked at each other once and then took off running at full speed back towards our cabins. We didn't speak of it until the next time we could be together without anybody else around because, how do you explain crazy talk like that? We had seen a lot of weird shit in our collective lifetimes, but none of us could explain what we saw that night. We tried to figure out how we could get some information on what we might have seen. However, we were stuck up in the mountains 5 days a week without TV, newspapers, or radio, and this is way before the internet. This sighting became the pivot point between the three of us, something we would always discuss and try to figure out but never could. After the semester was over, we all went our separate ways that summer. Ronnie went into the California Department of Forestry as a wildland firefighter. Tom traveled to Hawaii to work at a YMCA summer camp, and I headed back to Big Bear to work at a YMCA summer camp there. And this is where the story gets really weird. Neither Ronnie nor Tom lived to see the end of that summer. Ronnie was killed in the Spanish Ranch fire up near San Luis Obispo. Less than 2 weeks after learning that Ronnie was dead, I learned that Tom had disappeared off the coast of Hawaii. The story is that he was on the beach, got swept out to sea by a rogue wave, and then was eaten by sharks, and his body was never found. To say that I was mentally shaken would be an understatement. To have two of your friends who had witnessed an unearthly UFO encounter die in unusual ways within 6 months of seeing this UFO, one by fire and one by water, really freaked me out for a very, very long time. I kept thinking fire, water, earth, air. There were many years after this that I would not put myself in any situation where one of those elements could kill me. That's my UFO story. I still do not know what happened that night. All I know is that it was completely mind-boggling and changed my life irrevocably. I know what happened to Ronnie and have visited the site where he perished. Tom, on the other hand, may still be alive, as I have a strong feeling that he may have faked his own death. But that's a story for another time. Camping in the woods. Growing up, I was that child who worried adults with claims of seeing ghosts. They all laughed it off nervously, but I remember most of it clearly, even some events that happened when I was an infant. So clearly, that I can tell my mother details of the places that various events happened in, places that we lived before I was even 3 years old, etc. It bothers my family now, though, so I keep my mouth shut about it. Modernly, my boyfriend and I are ghost hunters. Which basically is a damn fancy way of saying that we waste our time and money running around various spooky places, trying to find ghosts. I have, from time to time, done personal investigations on people's houses. Note here, I don't know how they know who I am or how to find me, as I keep an extremely low profile in my town, or, I hate everyone that lives in it, and I literally do not socialize nor leave my house unless out of necessity. I've had one friend here, a fellow oddball like me who predicted his own death, but that is for a different story. A common joke amongst us, though, is we always seem to come across the best stuff when we've left all of our equipment behind, not to say we haven't caught intriguing things. Strangers tend to follow me closely, much like a starved dog follows a butcher's truck. One year, some friends decided that they wanted to go camping at a place called Rock City. This being western New York, much of the land here was once Iroquois Nation land, and Rock City was just off the edge of a Seneca reservation. It was the worst camping trip of my life, truth be told, and I was miserable the entire weekend. The stage, Rock City, was this huge mountain made out of, well, rocks. Exposed rock, dirt-covered rock, it was rock. It had been turned into a roughing it-style campground, with the lower mountain campsite having pagodas and being more common, and a smattering of farther-spaced ones with nothing more than a fire pit. We had wanted a pagoda site, but unfortunately they were all occupied, so we'd had to settle farther up one of the more distant roads for the basic style. There were a lot of trees that could survive in such shallow soil, but it left the woods a treacherous place of gnarled roots and slender, starved pines with a few smatterings of even scrawnier trees with barely any leaves on them. Occasionally, we would swear we heard the bubbling sound of a stream, but there were no such things around us, and the sound was never a constant, so we could not even hope to track it down. This left me with a particularly uneasy feeling from the get-go, but it would be nothing like how I would feel in the darkness. It was mid-June, and at that point of New York summer where it was hot as hell during the day and cold at night. Due to my unease, I had opted to be a constant contributor to watching the fire burn down to embers at the end of the night. I have a horrendous fear of the dark due to some childhood trauma, and it brought a plethora of electric lanterns, charged to the max on their long-life batteries, as well as chargers that would allow me to rejuice them in the car. I would set these out at strategic points in the camp to aid in late-night bathroom runs or just general vision if a black bear came blundering in. The last lantern was reserved for our tent and ran on independent AA batteries. Our first night, there were 7 of us and 2 dogs, mine and a friend's. Nothing too weird happened that night, except for me constantly waking up as I slept. I knew it would likely be down in the low 50s at night, Fahrenheit, and had packed a heavy-duty sleeping bag that was rated for Arctic temperatures. However, I still kept waking up, frozen to the core, shaking while simultaneously sweating. I knew I was not sick, so I simply blamed it on the ground, being rock and all that, still retaining a lot of the previous winter's cold. I'd lay there until I shivered myself back to sleep, usually only to wake up an hour or 2 later. The only truly strange occurrence was when, at one point, I woke to my boyfriend sitting up and staring at the wall of the tent. He wouldn't speak or respond, just stared. Normally, he's a quiet, unmoving sleeper, with no history of night terrors or sleepwalking like I have, but he'd done strange things in dream states a small number of times before, so I thought nothing of it and went back to burrowing into my sleeping bag. I expressed my gratitude to the higher powers for granting us a 2-night stay. The second night was when things got truly weird. Our numbers had cut to 5, as the other couple there had decided to split in the early morning, taking their dog with them. For some reason, my boyfriend had decided to keep our dog in the tent with him that night, and I was left with one of my best friends to watch the fire die. Conversation shifted from events of the day to spooky stories, and when we thought we heard something in the woods, we laughed it off. Just an animal, possibly a deer, running through. As we decided to call it a night, both of us exhausted, I set out the lanterns once more and headed into my tent to flick my little personal one on. After a bit of shoving, I dislodged my dog from my boyfriend's side and curled up to fall asleep. When I woke up, I noticed first that I was bitterly cold, yet burning hot. My body was covered in goosebumps, I could feel their little prickles all over my skin. The second thing I noticed, reaching over to grab my glasses, was a feeling that there was something in the woods directly behind our tent. Now, the tents were set up in this circular clearing, with my best friend's tent being close to the narrow dirt road leading into the campsite and another friend's tent on the opposite side but also a bit of a ways from the thick of the woods. Then there was another guy's tent, and our tent, nestled in the back of the clearing and butted up against the tree line. The third thing I noticed was a strong, horrifying sense of being watched, of something being directly behind me. And then I realized that every single light in the camp was turned off, including the one I kept in the tent. I shoved my boyfriend awake, frantic. "Why did you turn off the lights?" I whispered to him, and he hastily declined it, loudly at first but quickly toning down his voice. I quickly realized he had become aware of the same things I had noticed, including the sound of something behind our tents. It sounded like it was pacing, waiting as it tried to make a decision, and it sounded large. "Where is your lantern?" he whispered. "I don't know," I hissed back, my hands patting down where I had left it. We didn't have a huge tent, but I could not find it. Finally, I pressed my hands on it, oddly at the front flap of where we slept, which was half unzipped. I thrust it into his hands while I zipped the panel back up, and he tried turning it on, but it would not go. I changed the batteries, I informed him, and they were fresh. We shushed at this point because we had noticed very wrong had just happened. All the while my dog was extremely quiet and just stared at the back of the tent with his tail buried between his legs. My boyfriend and I curled up together, more out of fear than wanting to be close, and eventually ended up falling back to sleep. The sense of wrong that the occurrence gave the both of us was immense. We both spent the night shivering, yet swelteringly hot, sweating cold rivers and coated in goosebumps. We both had nightmares, though neither of us could remember what we dreamt about, common for him, but rare for me. The next morning, we all convened outside for campfire and breakfast making, and I hunted down our lanterns. Every last one was dead, some permanently so, they wouldn't light no matter the charge, nor the batteries, in the case of the small personal one I had kept to light my tent. Cautiously, I asked the collective if anything weird had happened the night before. Best friend, who was a sound sleeper and farthest from the woods, said no. Other far friends also denied anything, though something in his eyes told me he was lying. The friend in the tent next door, though, pretty much recounted our experience to the T. Of course, the first attempt was to explain it away. A bear or a deer? No. Wrong silhouette and too quiet. Could not have left that quickly. A drunk guy from another camp? No. Again, we would have been heard stumbling around in the woods, and were pretty far away from the other camps. A really quiet, sneaky hunter or just a random person? Again, the few steps we heard that lasted only a couple of seconds, it seems like he would have snapped one of the random twigs or tripped over a root or a rock walking in the dark forest like that. And how to explain all of the lanterns being off, including the one in my tent. On top of that, my dog is the sort that is friendly towards every human being ever, and if he had smelled another person, he'd have likely been whining to be let out and petted. Mass hallucination? Probably not, with friend next door about 7 feet away and in a completely separate tent, oblivious to my boyfriend and me. Bigfoot? We all laughed. At the time I had been rather interested in Wendigo and its various forms throughout different native tribes, studying as best as I could, so the joke was on me that a Wendigo had come to snack on me in my sleep, then shifted towards Slenderman as we worked on packing and picking up. Tee-hee, the Slendy came to get us and got scared off. The only skeptic in the party was the friend who I thought was lying, but that did not surprise me, as the man wants so badly to not believe in the paranormal that you can't even get him to watch a ghost-related movie. Given the electrical issues, though, as well as the sudden disappearance and the sensations that I had gotten during the nights, I had voted for something supernatural, and the boyfriend and friend next door had wholeheartedly agreed. Boyfriend and I were both country kids, and were more than aware of the various sounds that animals make, and should make, while darting through the woods, as well as the look of their silhouettes. Both of us have even come across black bears on our curious treks through the countryside. To finish, our car had an episode and had broken down. We got it started and were just beginning to leave the campsite when it crapped out, which was where best friend and I had to push the thing up and down hilly dirt roads to get it off of the one-way path our camp was on. Eventually he got it running again, and it lasted until we got a bit away from the park, when a tire blew. Cursing our luck and just wanting to go home, we dragged it to a reservation gas stop, where I knew the cashier. I had grown up somewhat near those parts, and my grandfather took me onto the res, as we called it, often. While the others used the toilet, I chatted up the man, mentioning that we'd been camping up on Rock City. He asked where I had stayed, and I told him, using landmarks. Big rock here, landmark plaqued rock there, circle turn here, and that was where our camp was, sort of. I mentioned, with a chuckle, that we thought we could hear a stream, but we never ended up finding one. Oh, you were there? No wonder you look so tired. My interest immediately piqued. What do you mean? There's something not right with the woods in that part. I don't like going up that way. Unfortunately, our rescue team of the aforementioned nearby family arrived about that time to get us retired and headed towards home, so I never got to recount my tale to him. My true camping nightmare. This happened during the summer of 2008. For context, I'm a gay male, and at that time I was in a relationship. We'll call my then boyfriend Mark for privacy reasons. Mark was 35, and I was 30. It was the July 4th weekend, and my boyfriend wanted to go camping. As he always is every July 4th. Usually going with his ex-wife and son, who is 7. However, since he is now out of the closet and wants to take me with him. A little about me, I'm definitely not an outdoor kind of person. I don't like dirt, I don't like bugs or wild animals, and the thought of not having running water or a roof over my head terrifies me. Yeah, I know I'm spoiled rotten. As reluctant as I was, Mark persuaded me to go and reassured me that this would be a weekend to remember. Well, he didn't know how right he was. He told me we would be leaving Friday morning, which was the 4th, and would come back Monday morning. As we both lived in San Jose, California, the nearest place to camp would be the Santa Cruz Mountains near Felton and the Big Basin Boulder Creek vicinity. We were going to go off the map in a more secluded area to experience nature and fewer people. We headed out Friday morning around 7 a.m. It was about a 45-minute to an hour drive. On the car ride there, Mark told me about these people that supposedly live in the mountains. The first thoughts that popped into my head were wrong turn and the hills have eyes. I told him that, and he chuckled and said no, but there are some similarities. He explained in great detail that these people were uncivilized, not socialized, unlike the rest of us in society, and could possibly be dangerous if we encountered one of them. They basically live like cavemen? He told me even though he has never come across any of them, he knows they exist and has even been told by his brother that they do indeed exist. Having just heard this, I flipped and told him it's a good thing you just sprung this on me now because you and I both know I would not have come along with you knowing this information. He explained, I'm just letting you know not to frighten you but to inform you of anything that should happen, but nothing will happen, I guarantee it. Oh really? I said, and how can you possibly guarantee me that? I always come prepared, he said. If you don't believe me, then open my glove compartment, he said, pointing to the glove box. I did as he asked and opened the glove compartment. Inside I noticed a leather case. I pulled it out. What's this? Fearing what I already suspected it was. I opened it, and right before my eyes was a revolver. A gun basically. I don't know what kind or anything, all I know is it was a black gun. This is your guarantee, I suppose, right? I told him. Yes, you must have known on some level that I wouldn't take us out into the middle of nowhere and not have us protected, he said. I guess maybe in the back of my mind I thought, yeah, but seeing it now makes me very uncomfortable, I said. Then also knowing that there is a slight chance of something happening for you to bring that gun makes me more scared than anything else, I said. He looked over at me and said, I will not ever let anything happen to you. This weekend is for us to enjoy each other's company, and that's what it will be. You'll see, he said. He did a good job of reassuring me because I didn't think about the gun again. We reached our destination not too long after that. All around me was just nature. Trees and trees, branches, rocks, and boulders everywhere. You could barely see the sky from all the trees blocking out the sunlight. We began to unload everything from his Toyota Sequoia. I was impressed by what he had brought. A 2-bedroom tent, a king-size air bed, and a portable generator with 3 outlets to run power off of. Wow, I said, maybe this won't be so bad. He smirked that smirk that I loved. Now that I think about it, I think it was more of an arrogant smirk. Well, my cell doesn't get any service whatsoever and is basically useless, but I did use it as my MP3 player. Smartphones were just starting to make their way available to us, but I had my Motorola KRZR then and was ready for the upgrade. Mark said, yeah, well, I need the power because I do have to get some work done this weekend, as he pulled out his laptop from the back seat. What am I supposed to do? Go play outside while you're working? I said. Don't be like that, I've seen all the books, magazines, and your Nintendo DS, so you obviously had ways to occupy your time as well, he said. He was right. I did bring things to entertain myself and was absolutely delighted that I could enjoy them longer with the help of portable electricity. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday were uneventful. We took hikes, made campfires, took naps, relaxed, and barbecued. I did actually enjoy myself. That is until Sunday night. We were in bed. Marcos was asleep, and I was reading an R.L. Stine Fear Street book. Yes, I know, but I love those books. I thought I heard something in the distance. Now I was kind of used to the little noises of animals like chipmunks and squirrels running around through the leaves, but this sounded more distinct. Footsteps, not that of a 4-legged animal. It sounded more human-like, like someone was trying to walk as quietly as possible. No, I thought it was just my imagination from reading this book. I set the book down and started to strain to hear more. Closer, whatever it is, it's getting closer. A bear? Maybe? I looked over at Mark, who was sound asleep, contemplating what to do. The footsteps reached the tent. Right above our heads was a zippered screen window that we had zipped closed, and that was where whatever it was outside had stopped. I held my breath. All I could hear was my rapidly beating heartbeat. I heard someone else breathing. Not Mark, whoever it was outside. I wanted to wake Mark up, but I knew if I did, he would make some kind of noise, and that would alert whoever it was out there that we were awake. That was when I heard a click. I know that sound. It's the same click sound when I open up my pocket knife. Oh my God, I thought, this is it. This is where I'm going to perish. Damn you, Mark, I thought. I knew this was a bad idea. That's when I heard a scraping sound running across the tent. I knew what they were doing. They were running that knife all around the tent. Taunting us. I knew this person had to know one of us was awake. Why else would they be doing that? The sound of the blade went all along the side of the tent and came back around to where we were. Then started again. It was then I nudged Mark to wake up. Mark, I whispered to Mark. He started to groan. What? And I said, shh, I whispered, there's someone outside. I couldn't see his face or anything for that matter because I had turned off the reading light. There is someone outside, I whispered. Look. I then saw a flashlight shining on the tent. Mark reached over the side of the bed, grabbed his case, and pulled out that revolver. He yelled, stop. Whoever the duck is out there, I have a gun, and I will not hesitate to shoot you in the face. Leave now or I will. The flashlight switched off, and whoever it was started to walk away. Not even a speed walk, just casually walking away and without any light, and it was pitch black out there. Mark held onto that gun as I lay there in horror. Silence, nothing. We didn't say a word, just listening for any kind of sound. Somehow in all that chaos I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to Mark shouting my name to come outside. I rubbed my eyes and looked at my watch. It was 6:15 a.m., and it was already light outside. I darted up and ran outside to see what he was yelling about. I ran to him to see him kneeling down by his tires. Slashed. I looked at the other ones, and they too were slashed. The driver's side and passenger side windows had been shattered. "What the hell?" I shouted. "What are we going to do now?" Mark grabbed my hand and said we're going to walk back to the main highway as fast as we can before whoever did this comes back. "My wallet!" I cried. "I need my wallet, my keys, and my phone." My phone was still in the tent inside my bag. I rushed over to the tent and grabbed my messenger bag, realizing, oh wait, my wallet and keys are in the glove box. Oh shit. I said the glove box. I ran over to the Toyota and swung open the door to notice the glove box was torn open and everything gone. I started to cry, realizing that this situation is too much for me to deal with. My heart sank into my stomach, and my knees got weak. I felt like I was going to faint. "Mark, they have my driver's license, my house key, my money, and my bank cards." I cried. "Duck!" Mark yelled so loud I heard his echo in the distance. "Let's go now," he said. "It's only about 1.5 miles to the highway. We're going to have to flag someone down or find a call box since my phone is dead," he said. "Don't say that word, please," I told him. Weak and scared, I started walking with him down the dirt road we drove just a couple of days prior. As we walked, I could sense there was someone or something else near us. I had that feeling of being watched. "Oh no," I thought, "please let us get out of here in one piece." "Mark," I said. He stopped me, putting his finger to his lips, and said, "I know. I don't think we're alone. I can hear leaves crunching. I think we're being followed. Just keep moving and know that what I told you on the way here, I mean it. I will do whatever I have to protect us. I won't let anything happen to you." Thank goodness for that gun, I thought, but I wish we weren't in this predicament to begin with. Speed walking got me tired and thirsty. Then I could hear cars in the distance. "We're almost there," I said. "Yeah, we are just a little more." Finally reaching the highway, I pulled out my phone, and I had a signal. Not much battery but just enough for us to call the police, and Mark called the police. They were there in less than 5 minutes. 2 patrol cars arrived. Mark explained everything while I sat on the curb. I was questioned about the events and said all my identification and cards were stolen, as well as my house and car keys. The officer told me to cancel all those cards immediately and have my house locks changed ASAP. He suggested also to have the vehicle lock changed. 2 more officers arrived, taking Mark and me back to the camp. I really didn't want to go, but having the police with us, I felt somewhat safe. Mark had called his insurance and was expecting a tow truck there soon. When we arrived, 3 of the officers looked around, took pictures, questioned us some more, and sealed off the area with yellow tape. Made it look like a crime scene, which I guess it was because a crime did take place there. The officers asked Mark and me if we had any idea who or why someone would do this. I said no, and furthermore, I didn't tell anyone besides my mother and best friend that I was coming, but I didn't say where. Mark said he only told his ex-wife, who was at home with their son. The officer explained to us that it was most likely an isolated incident and it could have been someone who most likely didn't agree with our alternative lifestyle. Big surprise, I thought, but even this was extreme, and I wasn't really buying that load of crap the officer was telling us. Seemed like he knew more than what he was telling us. "So what's going to happen now?" I said. The officer told me, "Well, we have your information and report. We will investigate, and we will search for fingerprints and other evidence. If and when we come up with any leads, we will let you know. You might have to testify against any culprits we apprehend. Until then," he said, "get all your locks changed, cancel your credit cards, and let us know if you come up with any new information." Great, I thought. So, that's it. The officer couldn't give us any more information as to who or why this happened. About 10 minutes later, the tow truck arrived. We gathered all of our belongings. I was confused that nothing in the tent was stolen, not even Mark's laptop. Now if I let my imagination run wild, I could think of other things that didn't make sense, but I didn't want to go down that path. On the way back to the city, I was so much in disbelief. I wanted to say to Mark, "I told you so," but he looked so hurt and confused I couldn't do it. Plus, it sucked to be right. I mean, I really did want to enjoy myself this weekend, and it started out pretty good. I got home and immediately canceled everything and had my mom call the locksmith and change all the house locks. I made an appointment for my car to get the locks changed and left it in the garage. I was still tense just knowing someone had my address and keys. Even though they couldn't unlock my house door, that wouldn't stop them from breaking in. Nothing ever came of the situation, or if it did, Mark never informed me of it. We spoke about it, and he was constantly checking in with the police department. He bought a new SUV, he didn't want any kind of reminder of that weekend. I agree with that. We broke up a few months later for other reasons. I always wondered if he ever went camping again after that or if he ever regretted that weekend. As for me, It's been 12 years since that horrible weekend. I now live in a different state where people do camp a lot. Good for them. I haven't camped since then, and I never plan to do so again.